A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I've always considered myself a rational person, never one to delve too deeply into the supernatural. However, the past few weeks have shaken the foundations of my reality and my skepticism. It all began when I received an old, dusty lamp in the mail, an anonymous gift delivered without a return address. Giggles of excitement escaped me as I polished the lamp as a joke, whispers of childhood fantasies dancing through my mind. To my utter shock, a swirling cloud of darkness erupted, forming into a figure, a genie, its presence somehow both chilling and mesmerizing. Now, what I found strange was the genie didn't offer me wishes. Instead, it simply laughed, a low, reverberating sound that seemed to echo through my bones. Then it vanished just as quickly as it appeared, leaving me with an unsettling sense of dread. A week later, as I was trying to dismiss the lamp incident as a dream or hallucination, my phone rang. It was from an unknown number, and the voice on the other end was a lisping whisper, repeating the phrase, "The wish has been made." Goosebumps prickled my skin, but I had no idea what the message meant until strange things began to happen. It started subtly, doors that I knew I had locked left swinging open, items disappearing only to reappear in odd places. Soon, though, the occurrences escalated. I'd wake up to find strange symbols drawn on my walls, written in what appeared to be my own blood, though I had no injuries. Paranoia crept into every corner of my mind as I began to feel eyes constantly watching me. I started seeing shadowy figures in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned my head, they vanished. One night, my reflection in the mirror didn't mimic my movements, instead, it grinned widely, its eyes alight with a sinister gleam that wasn't my own. Desperate for answers, I trawled the internet for any hint, any clue, or similar stories. Eventually, in a sketchy forum, I found an obscure thread, an ancient lore describing how genies could not just grant wishes, but inversely, could fulfill the darkest desires of others upon us. Someone had indeed made a wish for my demise. Sleep-deprived and terrified, I sought help from a so-called paranormal expert. He advised me to find the wisher soon, for as long as the wish remained unfulfilled, I'd be hunted relentlessly by misfortune. He described a ritual to trace back the curse's origin, a ceremony as baffling as it was terrifying. With no other options, I followed his instructions, using the accursed lamp, candles, and the blood tempo of a midnight heartbeat. As I performed the ritual, the world flickered, and I found myself in a void, standing before the genie, its eyes glowing with malevolent amusement. "Who wished for my death?" I demanded. The genie cackled, its voice resonating like a crypt song, a soul with a heart full of envy and a mind touched by madness. The scene shifted, and before me appeared an acquaintance from college, someone I barely remembered, a person whose name I had to strain to recall, Ben, a guy I'd helped occasionally with assignments. His life had fallen apart after college, jobs fretted away, relationships splintered, envy fermented and twisted into hate. He had found the lamp years prior, used his wish, and the genie had waited patiently for the chance to execute this dark desire. Heart pounding, I realized I needed to confront Ben. Tracking him down was surprisingly easy, given his down-and-out public social media cries for validation and vengeance. Cornering him in his shabby apartment, I revealed everything, the genie's existence, the curse, and his damning wish. His eyes widened, horror mingling with guilt as he broke down, admitting he'd wished it in a moment of despair, thinking it an impossible landmark of his hate. Ben and I returned to my place. I insisted he needed to rescind the wish. In a final standoff with the ethereal presence, Ben fell to his knees, weeping, pleading for the genie to revoke his wish. I watched as the air shimmered, the room darkened, and finally, after an agonizing pause, the genie acquiesced with a grudging whisper that felt like a storm receding. The sinister occurrences around me ceased immediately. The relief was palpable, the weight of doom lifted. If I learned anything, it's that darkness lurks not in the shadows cast by the lamp's light but in the shadows of human hearts. Even the playful notion of wish fulfillment can become a nightmare when tainted by envy. Now, as I stare at the cursed lamp sealed in a concrete block, soon to be sunk into the sea, I decide to break my rule and share what happened. Because everyone has secrets they wish they could have answered, but some secrets are better left buried. I never expected to encounter something unimaginable at the yoga studio, a place of peace and tranquility for most of us. The Tuesday evening class was always packed, filled with people looking to unwind after a long day. As the instructor, it was my duty to ensure everyone was comfortable and had enough space to practice without disturbance. That's why it caught my attention when an unfamiliar woman walked in, eyes scanning for a spot. I noticed she paused when she saw an empty mat space in the back corner, an area many avoided, not due to lack of space, but because of an eerie incident a few months back. A regular student, Alex, passed away suddenly during a session, and it left an unsettling vibe in that particular spot. Most of the class still whispered about it, convinced that Alex never truly left us. When the newcomer laid her mat down in that space, a chill rushed down my spine. I never felt anything supernatural, just an odd tension in that spot, a sense of heaviness in the air. As I began class, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My mind told me to ask her to move, a whisper of paranoia, perhaps, or a genuine gut feeling. But then again, what would I say? "Excuse me, could you move because some people think this place is haunted?" Would surely make me seem ridiculous, and perhaps she was someone who didn't believe in such things. Determined to focus, I initiated the session. The usual rhythm of focused breathing and gentle stretching commenced, but my attention kept drifting back to her. She seemed offbeat, as if she wasn't entirely present, or maybe she merely had her own sequence. My concern for disturbing the class balance warred with my curiosity, and a strange anxiety continued to brim beneath my professional demeanor. Soon, as we transitioned into more complex poses, the lights began flickering, throwing unsettling shadows along the walls. I heard gasps, students faltering mid-pose as the strobes of light created an uncanny, almost ethereal atmosphere, casting warped versions of us along the reflective studio mirrors. Then came the whispers, echoing quietly at first, rising like an imperceptible background frequency, words I couldn't distinguish. Everyone else seemed focused, unfazed, their faces serene masks, but when I glanced back at her, the new woman seemed transfixed, staring fixedly at her own reflection, as if in a trance. I knew I should end it there, break the spell of unease that tightened around us, but it was as though words lodged in my throat, paralyzed. Time warped into an infinite stretch, and within that warped instant, I saw her reflection change. It shifted subtly, facial features morphing, the eye sockets deepening, cheekbones growing sharper. It looked like Alex. Involuntarily, I took a step back, feeling a palpable force radiate from her, a gravitational pull of fear that clamped down on my heart. When she finally turned toward me, still in her spot, the flickering lights ceased, leaving only the dim ambience of the evening studio. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if waking from a shared nightmare, and the class continued, albeit with a muted tension. As I closed the session, hesitant eyes hovered over me, waiting for my explanation or perhaps seeking reassurance that everything was fine, yet I offered none. The woman approached me, smile benign but eyes knowing as if she had discovered an unspoken secret. "Thank you for the class," she said softly, walking past. In that fleeting moment, a cold breeze entered the studio, rustling the mats, a reminder, perhaps, that some boundaries should not be displaced, that some spaces were meant to be left undisturbed. But the haunting question, one I dared not voice aloud, lingered. Had Alex truly returned, or had I become a lingering specter of my own irrational fears? When I reached for my phone later, I instinctively typed a message intended for no one in particular, seeking absolution for letting a mystery remain unsolved in the shadowy folds of our everyday sanity, a mythasolita for not forcing this yoga student into a different mat spot. And as my fingers hesitated over the post button, a curious feeling, a knowing chill in the normally warm studio, suggested that sometimes, the mysteries we choose to leave untouched are the ones that silently watch us, waiting, from mirrors or the dim corners of our own reflections. Alright, brace yourselves because what I'm about to confess might send a chill down your spine, especially if you've ever indulged in fast food chicken nuggets. Let me take you back a few years to when I worked the late-night shift at our local fast food joint. I wasn't just another teenager killing time and hunting for booze money, I had a purpose. I did something that most of you might consider a blessing, perhaps even a hit of pure luck, a gift from the nugget gods. But behind those cheeky extra McNuggets, there was something darker. It started innocently. I was a bored high schooler, feeling invisible under those greasy fluorescent lights, just another pawn in the grind of minimum wage. I started adding an extra McNugget to random orders because, hell, why not? It wasn't coming out of my check, and the delight it brought to unsuspecting customers was a drug in itself. But what began as petty rebellion morphed into something I never anticipated. One particularly slow night, close to the graveyard shift, I noticed a pattern: strangers who came in looking normal, like weary travelers, ordinary parents with screaming kids, or that loner teen with hooded eyes. Once they got those extraordinary meals, they'd return, not always the next night or the next week, but eventually, with a glow in their eyes that I recognized. We exchanged wordless smiles, A silent understanding, as if they knew that someone had handpicked them, made their lives incrementally, digestively happier. With time, these customers became familiar, their lives somehow intertwined with mine. What I didn't realize was that they weren't just coming back for the tantalizing chance of an extra nugget, they returned because they were becoming addicted to something far darker than fast food. Beneath the surface, those McNuggets carried a shadowy secret I was oblivious to. Our food shipment had changed suppliers without warning, and nothing was quite as it seemed. Not until one night, when a shadow cloaked the counter, a face so unsettlingly familiar it made my stomach curl. He leaned in, reeking of something sour and mossy, like forgotten graves. Without saying much, except for a casual "Hey kid, nice night for extras, huh?" I realized he saw through the gimmick, straight to the darkness nesting beneath fryers and sizzling grease traps. His eyes were like shards of coal, almost void of life, yet pulsating with something sinister. The grin he shot me felt omnipotent, as if crowning him the ringmaster of my puppet show. For weeks after that encounter, my nights warped into something not of time but of tension. Customers continued to come, but I noticed how they appeared different, not just happy, but eerily euphoric, their faces flushed yet skin taut over bones, eyes bulging like they've gazed into the abyss and returned with a taste that can never be satisfied without my intervention. Their increased frequency and fervor began to terrify me. They came during odd hours, restlessly peering through glass panes long after closing. One by one, they dripped in, some begging, some threatening, until it was clear that the extra McNugget trick had hooked them. However, it was the aftermath that sparked my dread. A string of reports on the news about missing persons overlapped disturbingly with my list of frequenters. The most unsettling part? Each report mentioned an unnatural obsession with fast food chicken nuggets just before their disappearance. Eventually, those reports dwindled, leaving a dark void in public discourse, and I could almost hear that sinister melody playing somewhere in the shadows, a hymn only I seemed to tune into. It was as if my little act of unauthorized generosity had connected these souls to me, and something far beyond me. I tried quitting multiple times, but the hold it had on me, and them, was inexplicable. Like a web, sticky and resilient, every other job attempt collapsed the moment a person walked in holding a crumpled nugget box, eyes locked onto mine like they'd wandered through galaxies just to find the creator of their boundless longing. Sometimes I'd wake at night drenched in sweat, a ghostly whisper haunting my dreams, "Fetus." I'd see flashes of all those faces, including the ones that stopped returning, like flickering shades in a nightmare carnival, forever hungry, forever searching. As time and courage betrayed me, stacking the odds against breaking free, I became aware that the greasy little packets weighed more than just processed chicken. They bore cravings, desires, and stories of lives slipping away. The last shift I worked, that strange man returned, strikingly unchanged as if time bypassed him. He leaned across the counter, those eyes promising a twilight of peace, or the complete absence thereof. "You were chosen," he murmured, "to feed souls beyond your world." Then he slid a nugget towards me, a maddening echo of those I'd once given out like candies. Only now, the gesture felt final, a haunting cape swirled around my fading sanity. That encounter sealed it for me. I've stayed on the move since, working nights at random gas stations, diners, anywhere those familiar faces can't find me. But even there, the allure trails like an insidious shadow. No matter how far I run, echoes of crackling fryers, oily vats, and greedy munching haunt my reality. Sometimes, just sometimes, I'll catch someone casting a veiled look my way in another rundown diner at 3 a.m., always with that same insatiable hunger in their eyes. And I know they were looking for something I inadvertently promised them years ago. But now, it's a curse I can't escape. So next time you find an extra nugget in your box, enjoy it cautiously. After all, you never really know who's behind the fryer or what dark secret they've unwillingly passed to you. When my friend Eric disappeared, the last place anyone expected to find him was the labyrinthine cave system known as Devil's Maw, a sprawling network of tunnels that twisted like the vines of an ancient curse beneath our sleepy town. You see, Eric wasn't the type to wander off into the unknown, especially not into places that had legends about people going missing. I went there alone, driven by a gut feeling that majorly felt wrong but was impossible to ignore. The sun was waning when I arrived at the cave's gaping entrance. A chill ran through the wind, whispering unsung warnings as the first stars flickered hesitantly in the dimming sky. People said the Devil's Maw swallowed light and spat darkness, and as my flashlight battled shadows, I felt those words lick at my spine. Each step echoed back eerily, a sinister mimicry of my every movement. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying an earthy musk intertwined with a hint of something metallic, blood? My breath shallow, competing with a chorus of bats that flitted like startled shadows, seeking refuge deeper within the caverns. The last contact from Eric had been a garbled voicemail, his voice strained, desperately cryptic. "Find me where the winds call between the stones, where shadows dance and light hesitates." That was it. Friends dismissed it as a prank. Eric's idea of a joke, after all, was an enigma wrapped in dark humor, but this felt different. Something in his tone clung to my bones and wouldn't let go, compelling me into this malevolent moi. The narrow tunnels branched unpredictably beneath my fingers that skimmed the jagged walls, now and then snagging on the sinister protrusions that seemed to reach for a taste of vitality. Something was watching me, yet nothing was there. My own heartbeat amplified, a war drum in these corridors to hell, urging both retreat and relentless pursuit. "Eric!" I called into the void, my shout devoured by the hungry silence. It felt endless, and if not for those sporadic, resonant drips of the cave's tears, I might have succumbed to the illusion of an infinite labyrinth. Time, in this place, dilated, an elastic nightmare stretching beyond comprehension or sanity. Hours, or days, it felt the same, passed, and just when despair began coiling tight around my resolve, I heard it, faint strains of laughter, choked and maniacal like laughter heard from a broken old gramophone. The sound entered through one ear, exiting the other, carrying a harrowing familiarity. Could it be Eric? I pressed forward, veering into a cavity where the ceiling yawned upwards, swallowed by shadows darker than blindness itself. The laughter crescendoed, morphing into a cry, a sharp, visceral clutch of horror that shattered resolve into shards, which I frantically pieced together as they fell. "Eric!" I shouted again, sprinting towards a speck of flickering light, an amber pulse in the distance like a heartbeat given form by the stillness. The passage expanded, its walls alive with undulating shadows that mocked my every move, swelling in their deception. The light drew closer, though its warmth remained cruelly unreachable. Emerging at the mouth of a cavern wider than imagination allowed, stalagmites clawed upwards, and there, their sinister poetry, sat Eric, crumpled like a forgotten puppet. His eyes were impossibly wide, orbs reflecting nightmares wholly absorbed. His mouth was in an eternal silent scream, frozen in eerie laughter. I stepped forward, my own laughter involuntarily mimicking his petrified facade. Then, the terrible truth, Eric's lips moved, seamlessly in a wordless prayer to this wretched abyss. The light was not a torch or any human illumination but something that emanated from the very rock, a mineral essence refracting impossibilities that blurred reality. Getting closer, I realized it was as if his very skin absorbed the glow, not reflecting it but symbiotically entangled with whatever resided within these stones. "Eric!" I pleaded, my voice carrying its shakiness like a forbidden burden. He turned slightly, somehow more rigid and fluid than a human should be capable of. His eyes bore into mine, yet he saw something else entirely, a vision beyond human grasp. "The Ma demands," he whispered, incongruent laughter threading each syllable. He pointed a skeletal finger towards the pit at the cavern's core, a blackness so absolute it devoured reality. The laughter grew within me as I approached, unbidden yet unshakable, harmonizing with the fractured echoes of the place. My will, to retreat, to save Eric, to survive, struggled in futility against the rising instinct to dive deeper, to understand what lay beneath the veil of reason this place obliterated. As I followed his lead, I felt not myself but something far vaster, seething beneath the surface of perceived sanity. In that moment, standing at the precipice, Eric's expression shifted, fathomless and enlightened, yet fundamentally absent. He tilted forward, folding into the black so smoothly he became one with it. The echo of his impact was not a sound but a resonance felt within my bones. I reached after an impulse for salvation or sense, the void reaching back, a cold embrace that seared with madness too enticing to resist. I never found Eric again, nor myself, really. When I was later found babbling on the outskirts of town, eyes hollowed by horrors unspoken, they asked if I was okay. I met their gaze, lips stretching mechanically, yet there's nothing joyful in my expression. The laughter remains tethered, steadfast at the corners of my mouth, a reflection of unspeakable truths. Now I'll never smile again, the Ma saw to that. Late one night, I found myself standing in line outside a decrepit old theater on the edge of town. Despite its crumbling facade and fogged glass windows, the place had drawn quite the crowd. People murmured excitedly about a new kind of cinematic experience being touted as life-changing. It was called the Mirage event, and entries were strictly limited. Invitations were whispered, not advertised. I'd heard about it from an older co-worker who swore it would unveil the perfect version of your life, showing you how to achieve it if you followed the steps they revealed inside. I was desperate. My life felt like a book stuck on the same page, and I hoped this could be my turning point. As I stood there, a routing marquee above us casting an ominous glow, I noticed the unconventional way the line was being monitored. A stern figure in a vintage usher uniform with a face like a forgotten dream seemed to float between groups, inspecting each person. The theater had promised the experience to the first 100 people in queue, and I was around the 85th. As minutes crawled by, the haphazard line formed naturally, but tension simmered when a frenzy of late arrivals started disputing who was there first. That's when a glimmer of an idea flickered in my mind, a way to gain an edge. Amidst the unrest, I casually suggested organizing the inchoate line based on physical position rather than mere arrival time, downplaying any notions of fairness while others debated. Surprisingly, my proposal took root, and people began to shuffle around according to the ragged physical line I started to establish. In the confusion, a couple ahead of me got pushed to the back of this newly formed line, their protests were lost in a cacophony of rustling coats and disgruntled murmurs. It was as if the crowd shared a collective eagerness to order through chaos, so rationalizing any doubts was quickly glossed over. But as I slipped into the prime zone, a strange aura seemed to encircle the place. The air was impossibly thicker, oppressive, and the night colder, almost whispering my name. I didn't notice until later, when the theater doors creaked open, how an unearthly silence swept through the crowd. A hush that spoke of secrets guarded for lifetimes. It sent shivers down my spine yet pulled me in with an irresistible force. One by one, people started moving inside, disappearing into the shadowy maw of the Mirage event. I was buzzing with anticipation when the usher caught my eye, their gaze piercing through me like a blade. There was no malice, but something else. Almost as if they knew my thoughts and didn't mind, or maybe they wanted me to carry the burden of my choices inside. As I crossed the theater's threshold, the atmosphere changed instantly, a sense of dread mixed with curiosity enveloped me. The interior was an otherworldly blend of ornate deco from yesteryears and a technological setup that seemed straight out of a fever dream. Rows of luxurious, velvet seats stretched out before the screen, each adorned with a small plaque that somehow bore the name of the occupant, mine included, though I know I never shared it aloud. It felt intimate, heavy with the knowledge of strangers who were no longer strangers. When the lights dimmed further, a low hum reverberated from the walls, a signal that the miracle was about to begin. The screen flickered to life with images too vivid to be real, but too personal to dismiss as fiction. I witnessed snippets of my childhood, anniversaries that never happened, and a life of dazzling happiness and fulfillment, a dream reality, only it wasn't mine, it was what could be. This perfect life, with all its impossible ups and few downs, unraveled before me in a sequence that seemed just out of reach. Temptation took hold. Was this what the others saw? Or did these revelations change according to who was watching? I never got to ask anyone as their faces blurred, lost to their own visions. As the film progressed, offering pathways and decisions I had shied away from in life, my mind grappled with guilt and longing. I forgot about the choices made moments earlier in line placement, the usurpation of fairness for strategic gain. Here, my life and its paths were laid bare, scrutinized and judged not by anyone else but by myself. Each revelation felt like a judgment day compressed into fleeting moments. The conclusion of this eerie saga wasn't the end, rather, it instigated a weighty silence, enforcing a reflection many weren't ready to accept. People left the theater in various states of mind, some weeping, others frantic with excitement perhaps over newfound purpose, while a few were silent, their faces masks concealing the chaos within. As I exited, I was still processing, yet troubled by a singular thought that wouldn't let go. It dawned upon me, a chilling realization that in my quest for self-betterment, I'd potentially altered someone else's course in line, a metaphorical and literal theft of destiny. Had I robbed those people of witnessing their best paths for the night? Was my eagerness damning them to mediocrity? The usher's knowing gaze replayed in my mind, suddenly colder, more condemning. It haunted me as I drove home, the quiet ride back punctuated by the echoes of choices made. For now, the infinite possibilities seemed closed off, sealed by my hastily bought decision. Even the reflective Lady Moon veiled herself behind clouds, unimpressed by earthly matters. I wondered if, given the opportunity, I could revisit that line and change my approach. But deep down, I feared the most haunting truth of all, that opportunities such as these are one-shot, unforgiving of arrogance and haste. And so, as I lay in bed, surrounded by whispers of imagined perfections, I questioned aloud, was I the antagonist of my own life's story? My dreams that night were filled with spectral figures waiting in lines that never ended, each step echoing with something just out of reach, a tantalizing promise of a life edited by choice, or lack thereof. When we first adopted Max, our loyal golden retriever, I never imagined I'd be here telling such an inexplicable story. Max had always been your textbook definition of a good dog, obedient, friendly, and most importantly, silent unless barking at birds or whining for a treat. As he aged, Max slowed down, his rich golden fur turning silver, much like prize trophies tarnishing over time. Despite that, he remained sharp, always knowing when it was time for his evening walk or when food was served. However, last winter, something strange began to happen. Max had started exhibiting behaviors not typical of old age or even common dog behavior, or at least not typical in my experience. It started with subtle changes, like staring at dark corners of the room, his eyes tracing invisible patterns on the walls. I chalked it up to old age, maybe his sight was going after all. But then, one cold night in January, I heard it, a sound that sent chills crawling up my spine. I lay in bed, caught between the cusp of dreamland and waking reality, when a whispered voice shattered the silence. "Help me," it said, so soft I thought it might have been the wind. But the wind doesn't whisper in English, and it doesn't come from the foot of your bed. The hair on my neck stood on end when I realized the voice had an uncanny resemblance to Max's barks, soft yet guttural. I was about to dismiss it as some bizarre trick of a dream when Max, lying at the foot of my bed, whined softly, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that screamed urgency. I shook my head, convinced I was reading too much into it, yet a part of me couldn't shake the feeling there was more to this. Every night, without fail, the voice returned, each time more distressed. "Please, help me," it pleaded, and I began to wonder if Max was trying to communicate something. The whispers were clearer now, but always just on the periphery of understanding, like an incomplete puzzle. I started recording these occurrences, thinking maybe I could catch something definitive, but every playback only echoed the hollow silence of my darkened bedroom. My friends laughed off my concerns, teasing that I watched too many horror movies, but the whispers were relentless, a nightly ritual I dreaded. I conducted some research about animals sensing paranormal activities, but the accounts I found were either inconclusive or clearly made for entertainment. Desperation led me to try other avenues. I brought in a psychic, a last resort for a skeptic like me. When she entered the house, her demeanor shifted, a wave of unease crossed her face. "There's something unsettled here," she murmured, focusing on Max, who sat by my side, uncharacteristically calm despite the stranger's presence. She closed her eyes, reaching out to him spiritually, her brows knitting. "He wants to help you. To protect you," she said, eyes springing open in a manner that made her look far older than her years. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but the seriousness in her gaze cut through my disbelief. Then one night, the voice changed, no longer a plea, rather a warning. "It takes breath away." Those words wrapped around me with icy tendrils. That day an ominous feeling settled over me, an anticipation of something dreadful. I checked every lock, walked through every room as if searching for an invisible intruder. With each sweep, Max followed, unusually silent, maintaining his vigil. Night came, draping shadows over my mind. I lay awake, counting the minutes, waiting for the whisper when an abrupt series of thumps echoed through the house, as if someone had dropped heavy books upstairs. Adrenaline surged through me, every sensible force imploring me to stay put. Yet, it was Max, darting towards the source with newfound energy, that pulled me along. Together, we ascended the stairs, my heart a drumbeat in my chest. I flicked on the hallway light, which swung eerily as if debating remaining on or plunging us back into darkness. We entered the guest bedroom, which I rarely used, a room preserved like a snapshot of a distant memory. The air was stifling, cloying, and a vague shadow lingered at the corner prompted by the thin moonlight slipping through the curtains. Max growled, a low rumble that resonated the understanding of a defender. My own breath felt heavy, time stretching impossibly as I strained my eyes to see what he was seeing. With sudden clarity, it appeared, a silhouette, not entirely humanoid, standing there, vague, menacing. Panic seared through me, an urge to flee screaming through my limbs, but I stood frozen, unable to look away. The shape moved suddenly, jerkily, and something in Max shifted too. He lunged, his body ignoring the weariness of age, barking with fervor I'd never seen before, driving the shadow back, away from me, as if physically manifesting his own protective aura. In the chaos, I grabbed a flashlight, casting a blinding beam across the room. The shadow dissipated as suddenly as it appeared, consumed by the light, leaving behind only the echoes of that haunting whisper. I sat on the floor, heart pounding fiercely, Max beside me, his breath heavy yet satisfied, a guardian whose duty knows no bounds. From that night, the whispers ceased, the dark corners of the room no longer a source of silent terror. It seems Max, with whatever wisdom or connection he had to this world and possibly the next, had sensed the danger and stood by me through it all. The thought of a spirit reaching out, using my old dog as a conduit to communicate, was beyond my every understanding, yet undeniably real. In Max's silence, the unspoken bond between us grew stronger, a testament to his unwavering loyalty. Still, sometimes, in the stillness of night, I find myself lingering in that guest room doorway, wondering if the shadows will whisper again, knowing that should they return, I won't be facing them alone. It's strange how you can get used to living with a shadow, like the void left by my sister's death 10 years ago that swallowed most of our family. Laura's passing was the tragedy that everyone in our small town seemed to acknowledge quietly while collectively turning a blind eye to the painful truth. She vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but her favorite sneakers on the riverbank and unanswered questions stifling any conversation. Despite the lack of closure, the community rallied around my parents, and in the cocoon of silence, life moved on, or at least pretended to. I was only 14 when it happened. Her disappearance cast a long, cold shadow over my adolescence that never seemed to lift. My parents were never the same, lost in their own bruised worlds of coping. They left me to twist and grow like a neglected willow bending toward the last vestiges of warmth. A decade later, I thought I'd seen the last of any fresh pain. Then, the unsettling news reports started. I stumbled upon the first one late on a Thursday night, when a guilty bout of insomnia had me flipping through channels, hoping for something boring enough to lull me to sleep. Instead, I froze, paralyzed by disbelief and an eerie sense of recognition, as the reporter's grave voice narrated a story I never expected to hear, let alone with such haunting conviction. It was a reopening of my sister's case, broadcasted without any warning. The anchor recited details that sent a jolt of alarm through my core, information that was chilling in its rightness yet deeply disturbing in its revelation. Laura Jarvis, aged 17, disappeared on a crisp October evening, leaving little but her worn Converse on the Sydney River shore, the voice droned. But then it twisted into something intimate and almost sinister as it added details of her last known frames on a CCTV, showing more of her evening walk than we'd ever been told, where she'd lingered, whom she might have met. I sat glued to the television screen, the all too familiar ache in my chest morphing into something spikier, as if pieces of truth were trying to pierce my denial's cloak. Intrusive, indeed, as the report trespassed through memories I had carefully buried, unpacks parts of our family's history intertwined with the town's secrets and whispers I was never privy to. I was about to share this new anguish with my parents when the air shifted around me, the TV's neon hue the only company in the thick silence. Something was deeply amiss. These channels never reported such cases so thoroughly, certainly not rekindling old fires with such precision. The days slithered by with more peculiar broadcasts following, hushed narratives of encounters long forgotten, as if the television were a spectral storyteller reviving a ghost with every headline. It didn't stop at rehashing events already woven into my bones, it began revealing pieces no outsider should have known. Detailed accounts of Laura's closed-door confessions about an unseen tormentor, revelations startling in their specificity, ones that struck nerves only a sibling could feel resonating with guilt and credence. Suddenly, everyone knew about the bruises she'd brushed off as clumsiness, the uncharacteristic lateness after school. Local media feasted on this newly acquired morbid interest, and I felt the town buzz with a grotesque kind of excitement, a revived thrill of a decade-old mystery. Something peculiar was intertwined with these reports. They didn't just enlighten, they planted seeds of paranoia. Living in a town where privacy is both respected and resented, these broadcasts were not only salt on the wound but a scalpel cutting through carefully healed seams. I found myself drawn into a rabbit hole of news clippings, editorials riddled with veiled accusations, and blurry video analyses that had cropped up on online forums. It was as if some unseen hand was puppeteering from the shadows, orchestrating a symphony of madness tuned to my sister's frequency. The real horror, however, wasn't just the unearthed past. It was the chilling accuracy of these reports that got under my skin. Details I hadn't even been privy to, moments that no one but Laura could have known. It was as if the veil between life and death had worn thin, her tale being spun anew from the fibers of some ghostly ether. I debated reaching out to the network, but each time I lifted the phone, an inexplicable dread seized my courage. Some part of me urged that pushing for answers might open doors best left closed, doors I wasn't sure I could bear peeking behind. But the questions clawed at the back of my mind, ravenous. How could they know? Was this some cruel joke, an elaborate invigilation set to rip open old wounds for the sake of salacious consumption? It was after the third week of sporadic, disquieting broadcasts, when a stranger's face flashed across the screen, claiming to be privy to Laura's last moments, that I was hit with a more petrifying thought. Perhaps my sister's story was no longer hers alone, trapped somewhere, caught in the currents of a narrative not even death could quell. Or perhaps, more haunting yet, she was reaching out, through the static, layers of time and space, a broadcast not from some sensational agency, but from beyond our sentient scope, bidding us to pay heed. And as I sat, entranced in the eerie glow of my living room with thoughts curling like smoke toward an unexplainable conclusion, I knew this was far more than the sear echoes of a cold case. It was Laura's final plea, straining against the tide of time, hoping her truth would at last, after years of silence, come effulgent and complete. When I was a child, the woods behind my house were my playground. But even in my innocent youth, I understood that these woods were different, especially when the sun dipped below the horizon. You see, my best friends lived there, and they weren't like the imaginary friends most kids invent. They were real, and they were monsters. I first met them on a rainy autumn afternoon. I had followed a trail of mushrooms that led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever dared go alone. The air was thick with the tang of loam and decay, and the canopy above was a mosaic of dripping foliage. That's when I saw them, Sori, a lanky creature with wiry limbs and a face like a wilted flower, and Gunder, a hulking beast of moss and bark, eyes glowing faintly from deep within a cleft in his chest. Childlike curiosity overpowered fear, and I stepped closer. To my surprise, they didn't run. Instead, they studied me with something akin to interest. Our communication was silent, yet I understood them intrinsically. They weren't monsters in the fairy tale sense, but beings of the forest, woven into the very fabric of the earth. Our friendship grew in stolen moments and whispers carried on the wind. They showed me secret paths and taught me the language of the rustling leaves. In return, I brought them stories of the human world, tales of bright classrooms and the strange magic those places held. My parents never knew where I spent my afternoons. To them, the woods were just a wild stretch of wilderness to be wary of. They didn't know it was a refuge, a place where laughter echoed without judgment and where my heart beat in harmony with the forest. As the seasons changed, the woods transformed with a kind of magic I can only describe as timeless. Sori and Gunder would often vanish, sometimes for days, only to return with tales of migrations and strange happenings in distant groves. One winter night, Sori led me to a frozen pond, where the ice formed patterns like spiderwebs. As I skated on its surface, an unnatural stillness enveloped the air. That's when the ground beneath me quivered, and cracks webbed out from where I stood, singing a sharp, crystalline song that filled the night. I didn't fall. Instead, I was lifted by an invisible force, carried back to the shore by an unseen hand. It was then I realized how much the forest, and my friends, cared for me. Over the years, my parents started to notice the time I spent wandering outside their watchful eyes. They warned me of predators and dangers, tales passed down through generations, stories meant to keep children close. But they didn't understand, the real danger lay not in what I could see, but in losing the connection I had forged. As I entered my teenage years, life inevitably drew me away with promises of adventure beyond the forest. High school, friends, responsibilities, these became my focus, and my visits to the woods grew infrequent. I noticed a change in the air, a kind of waiting, a holding of breath by both the trees and my dear friends. Graduation came, a blur of excitement and the ringing promise of new beginnings. The world was vast, and I longed to explore it. But something kept tugging at me, a pull I couldn't ignore. On the night before I was to leave for college, I returned to the woods one last time. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, painting the ground in silver and shadow. I found Sori and Gunder waiting for me by a circle of ancient stones, their forms more ethereal than I remembered. Time had worn them gentle as though the edges of their shapes had been softened by patience and longing. There was a sadness in Sori's eyes, a deep understanding that I was moving on to another chapter they couldn't be part of. Gunder's large form loomed reassuringly still, emanating a warmth that spoke of quiet acceptance. We stood there, my heart heavy with the weight of imminent goodbye. They didn't speak, yet their presence was enough, a silent vow of eternal friendship. Before I turned to leave, Sori reached out, brushing a feather-light touch against my cheek, leaving behind a lingering tingle of comfort. As I stepped back into the world that night, I knew a piece of me remained with them, interwoven in the tapestry of the forest. Years passed, and life continued to pull me farther away. Yet, memories of my friends in the woods stayed vivid, a secret story that grounded me when the rest of the world became unfathomable. On the rare occasions I returned, the forest welcomed me like it always had, As though time stood still in those woods. But Gunder and Sori were no longer there. Even still, their essence lingered in the gentle rustle of leaves and the crisp smell of pine, a comforting reminder that somewhere, they still watched over me. Although my best friends were monsters, they taught me about the profound beauty in things others might fear, showing me that true friendship transcends the boundaries of form and time, resonating in the soul long after the echoes of childhood fade. The wind howled through the skeletal trees that lined the dimly lit street as I slowly made my way towards my brother's place. There was always something uneasy in the way the shadows clung to the corners of those cracked sidewalks, as if waiting to whisper secrets to anyone brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to listen. My brother, Aaron, had invited me over for dinner, and reluctantly, I agreed. The night was black as pitch by the time I reached his old Victorian house, its looming silhouette akin to those Gothic horrors where every creak in the floorboard seems to tell the tales of restless spirits. I shivered, not from the cold October air, but from an unsettling feeling I couldn't quite shake off. As I opened the creaky gate and stepped onto the overgrown path, I caught a flicker of movement from one of the upstairs windows, but when I looked again, the curtain rustled back into place, the room above disappearing into an abyss of darkness. It was nothing, I told myself. Just kids playing. Aaron had 2 children, Tommy and Lizzie, both under 10 but with the combined chaos of a tornado. The moment I stepped into the house, I was met with an overpowering scent of something burnt mingling with cinnamon, an assault on the senses if ever there was one. Aaron greeted me with a slap on the back, acting like all was well, as if we hadn't spoken less in the last 6 months and I wasn't here out of some obligatory need to reconnect. But his smile faltered for a split second, his eyes betraying a hint of tension. That's when I knew something wasn't quite right. Dinner was a cacophony of noise, the television humming some cartoon theme song and the kids clattering about, speaking a language only they seemed to comprehend. Lizzie chattered incessantly, recounting some tale of playground heroics, while Tommy intermittently poked his sister, obviously finding joy in her escalating irritation. Their volume rose, unchecked by Aaron or his wife, Claire, who only threw a desperate, "Boys will be boys," my way. When my patience wore thinner than the soup Claire had served, I leaned across the table and muttered to Aaron, "Your kids are wild, man. They've got no home training." It was meant to be a gentle nudge, but the words tumbled out harsher than intended, slicing through the room's uproar. An uncomfortable silence pressed down as Aaron's eyes darkened with something akin to betrayal, a brewing storm beneath a seemingly calm surface. Claire too stiffened, her fork pausing in midair, and for a long moment, it felt as though the whole house held its breath. But then the kids resumed their shrieking breakneck speed as if my comment had been absorbed into the ether. Aaron murmured something under his breath, downcast, but the lightning flashed again in his gaze. "You don't know what it's like," he whispered fiercely once the kids had scampered off into the confines of their own madness, "how hard it is. They're not just naughty, okay?" His voice cracked on the last word, and there was a desperation, a plea hidden in the undertones of his confession. I didn't understand. How could I? It's kids being kids, I thought. But the strange occurrences began after dinner, subtle at first, sudden flickers of the lights and the television volume blaring unexpectedly, the kids giggling somewhere unseen, their laughter full of mischief and shadows. Yet, behind the cheerful mask, there was an unease, a chill in their voices that curdled my blood. Claire quickly dismissed my concern with a weak laugh. "They like to play tricks," she said, but I saw it in her eyes, the same fear flickering like the faulty light bulbs. As the clock inched towards midnight, the house seemed to grow heavier. I felt it in my bones, a tickling sense of dread that curled up like a snake in my gut. I decided then to air my concerns, confronting Aaron with what I saw as the root of the issue, the children. It was then his facade crumbled, revealing a raw edge that was more than exhaustion. Aaron and Claire weren't just struggling parents, they were scared. Tommy hasn't been himself since Lizzie. Her accident, Aaron confessed shakily. She was in a coma for days, and when she woke up, she was different. His words echoed ominously. How had I missed it? I'd seen Lizzie only months ago, a sunshine-filled child, brimming with curiosity. Now her eyes reflected a darkness that didn't belong there. "It's like they sensed something," Claire added, her voice trembling as though she were recounting a ghost story around a campfire. "Something unnatural." There it was again, that word. And with it, a heavy silence settled, thicker than the fog outside. A sudden giggle erupted from the shadows of the hallway, and I whipped around to see Lizzie peeking from the doorway, her eyes gleaming in the pale, ghostly light. "We have a new game," she declared, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. "Tommy taught me." Aaron's face paled, And in the briefest flicker of candlelight, I saw fear skitter across his features like a living thing. A scream then echoed through the house, breaking the quiet like a shattering pane of glass. Tommy was nowhere to be found, yet the walls seemed to reverberate with his cries. Panic surged through me. I turned to Aaron in confusion, but his attention was elsewhere, fixed on the darkened staircase as if something unseen had caught his eye. Together, we raced through the house, its cramped rooms now a labyrinth pulsing with shadows. By the time we reached the nursery, Aaron's face was etched with a horror so profound, it rooted me to the spot. There, amid the flickering shadows of moonlight pouring through the window, Tommy stood, blank-eyed and whispering into the void. And then I saw it, the reflection behind him. A hunched, grotesque figure lingered just beyond the glass of the old, dust-covered mirror. It was as if the dark had taken form, seeping into reality with an insidious hunger. My gut twisted with nausea and terror as I staggered back, realizing whatever affliction had gripped this home had long clawed itself into the children. Somehow, they'd opened a door that should have stayed closed. Panic-stricken, Aaron and Claire bundled the kids and fled the house, leaving me alone amidst the eerie silence, a silence that held 1,000 screams. Settling into the oppressive darkness, I felt its watchful gaze upon me. Had I been wrong? The words I'd carelessly spoken earlier now echoed back, mocking in my mind. Perhaps they weren't just unruly children. What lingered before them, and now me, inescapably, was something beyond this world, an entity feeding on the innocence of youth, weaving itself into the fabric of their games, their lives. As the clock struck midnight, the house inhaled, and I sensed it, resurfacing with a vengeance, whispering promises of madness. I once thought Aaron's kids just had no home training. In truth, something far darker than rebellion lurked within them, reshaping their reality into a nightmare I could never comprehend. Now, the uneasy quiet settled around me, whispering secrets of bygone terrors, and as I scrambled to leave, the faint echo of a child's laughter drifted gently through the deserted halls, signing my fear and sealing my fate in the house that was both a home and a haunting. When I was growing up in Pyeongtaek, just a stone's throw away from the hum and buzz of the American military bases, I often heard stories of young women, like ghost tales told to children. They whispered of romances with soldiers, as though they were haunting figures who'd appear at night and vanish by dawn. My mother tried to instill fear in me with these stories, hoping they'd serve as cautionary tales to keep me away from the influence of those who occupied our lands and our lives in ways we barely understood. Yet, as a curious 27-year-old woman, these tales only added fuel to my wanderlust heart. I worked at a small cafe near the base, and the shop was a quiet haven where the sharp, scorched smell of espresso clung to the afternoon air, mixing with the ever-present hum of military chatter. That's where I met James. He was regular, always seeming to bring the chill of foreign lands with him, which hung onto his hushed southern accent like a persistent fog. There was a warmth to his eyes, a contradiction that was endearing, and before I realized it, I found myself gravitating towards him, pulled by a force that seemed both fated and forbidden. Our nights were filled with whispered secrets between sheets, and his stories of life as a soldier were often veiled with a sense of longing for normality, something I had taken for granted yet never fully understood. I became a collector of stories, words unspoken by daylight and only revealed under the protective cloak of night. At some point, somewhere between the shadows of our clandestine meetings, I started to see military men less as conquerors of land and more as prisoners of their own battles. James was shipped back to the States after his term ended, leaving an emptiness that was quickly filled by others like him. Some part of me sought closure that never came, or perhaps a redemption of sorts in helping these soldiers unburden their hearts. It became a ritual, or a confession of sorts, as each man shared his tale, sometimes about the things they did, the missions they regretted, or the families they missed back home. It was a tapestry of agony and survival woven together to create an illusion of comfort, draped over the ache of steady discontent. There was Michael, who spoke of a recurring dream of running through fields of golden wheat only to stumble and wake up gasping at the crack of dawn, and Paul, whose theremin lullabies faded slowly into the static of lonely night watches. Each narrative was a thread that wrapped around my heart, slowly constricting it until breaths felt scarce. But it was with Ethan that the reality hit. The story seeped into mine like ink into water. Ethan, who was softer than the rest, had this disquieting aura about him. His enigmatic smiles were addictively mysterious but hid cracks underneath, like porcelain teetering on the brink of shattering. He often talked about shadows, not the ones cast by real things, but those of the mind, manifestations of unspeakable things he had seen. Once, he mentioned a mission gone awry, where echoes of gunfire morphed into haunting lullabies that lulled them into restless slumbers and left their minds in dissonance. One night, amidst the silken whispers of wind outside, Ethan confessed to seeing figures in his peripheral vision, apparitions of the fallen. These spectral beings followed him, not out of malice but in a silent testament to their shared history of fragmented souls. It was during one of these recitations, as he lay breathless beside me, that the true terror took root as he mentioned the woman in white. At first, it was just glimpses, fleeting flickers out of the corner of his eye, but as time passed, her presence solidified. She bore no hostility, only a silent sorrow that encased her visage, and with each encounter, her form grew more corporeal until she was as distinguishable in the room as Ethan himself. Her visits coincided with Ethan's diminishing vitality, his breaths became gasps, and the life seemed to drain from his eyes, replaced by a haunting hollowness. It was a balmy summer night when Ethan abruptly awoke, drenched in a sweat slick with fear, his eyes wide and unseeing. He said she had spoken for the first time, her voice a melody of echoes wrapped in the wisp of a chill. She uttered words in a language that was beyond his understanding but filled with a sense of finality, a goodbye not meant for him alone. He was visibly shaken, but before I could console him, he pressed a worn photograph into my hand. It was a picture of a young girl holding hands with a soldier by a cerulean sea, happiness radiant on their faces. "She found me," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of revelation. "My sister." From then on, the woman in white was all he saw. I watched helplessly as Ethan's vibrancy ebbed away with each passing night, pulling him further into a storm of fractured recollections and forgotten faces. He was disappearing before my very eyes, like a ghost whose presence waned with the rising sun. In a final act of desperation, I reached out to people from his past, only to uncover the chilling truth: his sister vanished years ago, lost to the tides of war, her fate sealed under the guise of collateral damage. Ethan's mind had fractured irreparably, haunted by the specter of unresolved guilt and regret in forming a new reality where sapphire oceans and childhood innocence clashed violently with the monochromatic shades of life as a soldier. One sweltering August day, Ethan left. A note by his pillow mentioned a journey he must take, to reconcile with his ghosts and lay them to rest beside the woman perpetually encased in pristine white. I found out later he joined those who embarked on dangerous missions, those hell-bent on redemption or seeking refuge in the endless expanse of conflict zones. Like the others before him, Ethan became another thread interwoven into the tapestry of memories that I'd taken it upon myself to preserve, a lingering confession echoing in the hollow chambers of my heart. I still work at that cafe, each cup served a homage to tales told under the spectral gaze of moonlit nights, and with every new face that walks in, I find myself pondering not just the secrets they carry, but whether the woman in white still lingers in the shadows of those evenings long past, silently bearing witness to the lives left behind. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until the night a girl appeared on our front stoop, a quiet silhouette against the flimsy glow of the porch light. At first, I thought she was just a trick of the shifting shadows. I watched her through the peephole, hair cascading down her shoulders like a waterfall of midnight, eyes fixed and unblinking on the door. She looked as real as the chilled air biting at the windows, but when I called for my husband, Mike, and turned back to the peephole, she was gone. I dismissed it as a misremembered dream until she showed up the next night at precisely the same spot. This time, I swung the door open and felt my breath hitch. It was as if she dissolved into the night air, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves behind. Confused and a bit shaken, I told Mike, who laughed it off, suggesting I was working too many late nights. But this became a pattern. Every night, exactly at 2:04 a.m., she'd be there, sometimes wailing so quietly it was almost inaudible, like a lullaby weaved with despair. I became obsessed, watching the clock as the seconds ticked down to her appearance, insomniac anticipation forming knots in my stomach. One chilling night, curiosity eclipsed fear, and I stepped outside to confront her. As I walked forward, the cold leached through my robe, chilling my bones. She stood unmoving, and when I reached out, my fingers touched nothing but cold air. No prints on the dew-slicked steps, no sign that a living soul had been there. Frustrated, I retreated back inside, only to glimpse her face, pale and pleading, mouth moving soundlessly. I turned on every light in the house, praying for the sun to rise, and researched until dawn, spiraling down rabbit holes about spirits, poltergeists, and time slips that seemed to share echoes of her haunting presence. We spoke to neighbors, hoping for validation or explanation, but they responded with confused glances and dismissive chuckles. During the day, I tore through old photographs, local history books, anything that could reveal who she was or what she wanted, but hit nothing but dead ends. The next night, when she appeared, I tried talking to her, asking if she was lost or in need of help, but was met with silence. I shouted, pleaded, and threw every logical thought into an attack to provoke her into responding. My heart, a relentless drum in the silence, nearly stopped when I heard her faint whisper in the depths of my mind, "I'm sorry." The voice thrummed with sadness, a child's voice tangled in ages of sorrow. Sleep-deprived and fraught, I grew withdrawn, hardly speaking to Mike as he chattered away in oblivion about weekend plans and office banter. The apparition's presence began to affect my dreams, descending like a fog over my nights. In them, I was always searching, barefoot and alone through twilight woods. She was there, ahead of me, just beyond reach, whispering fragments of sentences that dissolved before I could grasp their meaning. Desperate, I sought the help of a local psychic who came highly recommended. Within moments of entering the house, she shivered, confirming some presence lingered with us. With caution, she performed rituals, burning sage and murmuring incantations. We watched, hope flickering in the acrid smoke, yearning for liberation, but the girl remained, untouched and unchanged by the psychic's ministrations. As nights bled into weeks, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article while cleaning the attic. Dated over 50 years ago, it told the story of a girl, a child who vanished without a trace from our very neighborhood, her final sighting painfully aligned with the end of our driveway. Goosebumps seared my skin as her fate unfolded, an unsolved mystery entombed in the passage of time. Her name was Lucy Carver. That night, knowing her name made the encounter even more poignant. Her eyes, wide and mournful, begged for something, understanding, maybe, or a release. I no longer displayed the bravado as in weeks past. "Lucy," I whispered, cradling the thought like a fragile secret, "how can I help you?" The reply softened through the rustling leaves, "Find me." Though the town had long forgotten her name, the search for her remains consumed me. Historical society records suggested she might have been buried in the woods by a deranged neighbor, but no evidence had ever verified the claims. My determination to free her spirit saw me embarking on quests into those woods, the tranquil beauty masking an ominous undercurrent. Over time, I enlisted the help of a local historian and true crime enthusiast named Kevin who'd long harbored interest in Lucy's case. With his help, we conducted metal detection sweeps and cross-referenced every mustard-creased file we could access. One evening, just as exhaustion knotted my resolve, we stumbled upon something in a sun-dappled clearing. What we unearthed was heartbreakingly sparse, fragments of a small shoe, the buckle rust-encrusted, and bits of decayed fabric. As the realization sank in, a profound calm settled over the woods, the air lighter, as if the forest itself exhaled a breath held for far too long. That night, she didn't appear on the stoop. The minutes, then hours, passed, and the space remained undisturbed, a void where her presence once lingered. Finally, sleep fell into me like gentle rain, and for the first time in weeks, my dreams were my own. Lucy was free. There was, however, an unexpected aftermath. News of our discovery rekindled interest in unsolved mysteries throughout the town. While many hailed us as community heroes, the curiosity and whispers surrounding our involvement rarely diminished. The intense attention stirred fresh anxieties. Long after the story's spark dimmed for the townsfolk and Mike returned to his oblivious normalcy, I sensed an enduring vigilance within me. Even now, every so often as night deepens and silence claims the corridors of our home, I listen for the hint of footsteps, wondering if some secrets are ever truly buried, or merely waiting to surface from the shadows of the past. When the advertisement for the revolutionary product popped up on my social media feed, it felt more like a godsend than a marketing ploy. The ad was simple: confession, no more onion growing or armpit smell. Antibacterial spray, guaranteed. The declaration was in bold, vibrant letters, and the testimonials beneath it spoke of life-changing freedom from odors once thought to be incurable. At first, I dismissed it as another snake oil gimmick, but after a particularly embarrassing incident at the gym where my body odor cleared the exercise room, the allure of a smell-free existence became too tempting to resist. My friends called me Rick, but the entire office had other nicknames: Stink Bomb, Funky Brewster, and my personal favorite, Ripeness Rick. Personally, I knew the real issue wasn't with my hygiene habits. My perspiration had an aggressive assault on the senses, a demonic gift from my boisterous biology that no amount of showers or clinical-strength deodorants could tame. The package arrived in an unassuming brown box, and the contents looked as innocuous as they were promising: just a small bottle with a clinical logo and that enticing phrase repeated. The instructions were simple: spray directly on the skin's problem areas once a day. As I looked in the bathroom mirror, my coif of curls sticking messily to my forehead, I gave a sarcastic toast to myself and doused each armpit liberally, and then the groin for good measure. Over the next week, the change was nothing short of miraculous. Not only did the pungent onion-like odor cease torturing my olfactory senses, I felt different. Invincible maybe. There was a pep in my step at work, a newfound confidence that stemmed from the absence of the reeking albatross around my neck. Praise replaced the thinly veiled jokes, and I even scored a date with Jessica, the cute accountant I'd been eyeing since forever. Believe it or not, the spray was more effective than I dared dream, but even I was not prepared for what came next. One evening, as I lay in bed, a deep, unyielding itch settled into the depths of my pits and groin. The sensation spread like wildfire, morphing from an irritation to an almost unbearable burning. Underneath it all, a show that my skin felt thicker, tougher, realization dawned on me, too late. I had seen these symptoms before, they belonged to freakish headlines in the back pages of obscure paranormal tabloids. I rushed to the bathroom, splashing my face with cold water. The steam raised by my skin's unnatural heat fogged the mirror. As I raised my arms, sheer horror cascaded through my mind. Where once there had been hair, follicles dark and dense, only smooth scales glistened under the flickering bathroom light. Horrendous, rough scales that shimmered and twitched like creatures with lives of their own. Shuddering, I tried to scratch at them, tried desperately to peel them away, only for the skin beneath to pucker and tear like a rotten fruit. That night, sleep was a stranger. A blessed reprieve snatched cruelly from my grasp as the scales seemingly began their monstrous journey towards confluence, crawling and converging towards my chest, sprouting insidiously along my collars. I woke the next morning, a freshly grown festoon of scales around my neck, like a chain wrought by an unholy blacksmith. Work was impossible, I couldn't go in, couldn't allow anyone to see. My phone buzzed intermittently, the concerned faces of coworkers flashing upon it, but I remained steadfast in my refuge. Desperation clawed at my mind, driving me online for answers or solace. What I found instead were whispers, murmured accounts buried deep within dark forums, posts that hinted at a grotesque community plagued by similar battles. The advertisements were bait, promised miracles that only led to curses unimaginable. Each post a testament to the unending itchiness, to scales advancing on their own sinister journey across skin, and more disturbingly, to transformations that went far deeper. Incredulity pulled at my sanity when I read of those who claimed bipedal humanity was being snatched away from them, transitioning into creatures of nightmares, isolated, feral. The confessions diverged, some laced with the horror of relinquished limbs, others converging on a single grotesque revelation, voices, echoing, whispering, calling from the scales themselves, offers of a future, warnings of inevitability, summoning senses where none had belonged. I was at the brink of madness, spinning out of control. Waves of self-loathing and panic crashing against my resolve. But behind it all lurked an unwelcome acceptance. I was only one among many. Resigned, I dragged myself to the bathroom again, witness to the grotesque spread. The mirror's surface warped as if scorched by the presence of wrongness reflected back at it. What remained of my skin seemed mere patches within a tapestry of scales, my face barely mine and something's else. I had ceased spraying after the first nights, but it was too late for defiance or regret. With each passing day, my senses expanded, cries from the scales louder, clearer. They spoke, not in words, but in impressions, emotions, urgings towards surrender, towards understanding. It was tempting, the allure of synchrony with something greater, something ancient. Grace with a twisted hue as if dipped in the miasma of forgotten eons. I had sought relief, yet found communion, their confessions imprinting upon my soul a succession of revelations I would never fathom as a man. My date with Jessica never happened, couldn't happen, really. I was withdrawn, keeping my transformation hidden from all. The support turned into resignation, and the rumors of my fate possibly wilder than the truth took on lives of their own, becoming a legend for the ages or at least until the next victim found themselves missing morning coffee due to unwanted afflictions. And as I sit here typing my confession to you, dear reader, I feel the unrepentant tug of the void, the gnawing realization that my story is but a fleeting note in the grotesque symphony conducted by the unseen hands of fate. Perhaps you will heed my warning, or maybe curiosity will lead you down a similar path to mine, into the dark company of the scales. Remember, no matter what the promise of sweet release might hold, some solutions cost far more than we are ever prepared to pay. It all started on a day like any other, under the lusterless glow of the morning sky, as I trudged to my job at the nondescript office building that resembled a massive concrete slab more than an architectural achievement. My routine was numbing, a ritual of tedium that ate away at my soul like acid, but that day would be unforgettable. I had decided to try out a device my cousin had mailed me, An inconspicuous little vape pen that came with a note, "For stress relief, seriously, you need it." Now, I've been around the block with weed, but this was something different, something my cousin, known for his adventurous esoteric taste, had sworn was the next level. The first sign things were off was the immediate uptake, no warm-up to the experience, no slow crescendo, just an abrupt plunge into an altered state of hyper-reality where time trickled like syrup through the mind's sieve. It was nearing noon when I entered the office, and I had barely parked myself at my desk when the walls around me began to breathe. The drab grays and off-whites pulsed with a life they shouldn't possess, and I swear I could hear the distant hum of a giant engine thrumming beneath the building. Was it my heart? The flickering overhead lights took on a sinister rhythm, the fluorescent tubes buzzing out a Morse code I couldn't decipher but felt was ominously specific just for me. At first, these sensations were amusing, akin to the visual oddities one experiences at a funhouse, but they quickly escalated into something far more insidious. The computer in front of me loomed larger than life, each pixel on the screen expanding and contracting as though breathing too. I opened an innocuous spreadsheet, hoping the monotonous task might anchor my fragmented mind, but the columns became an ever-shifting maze of numbers, a digital labyrinth that seemed to extend into infinity. The numbers writhed like serpents, coiling and uncoiling, whispering secrets in a language I was terrified to understand. Panic gnawed at my insides, but it was another feeling, a prickling skitter of fear and loathing, that truly unsettled me, as though I were being watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes that revolved endlessly in an unseen realm just beyond the edge of my vision. I staggered up, needing to breathe air free from the manufactured staleness the air conditioning exhaled, and stumbled into the office's tightly enclosed break room. It was there that I met James, my kind but perpetually aloof colleague, who seemed suddenly transformed into a caricature of all things horrific. His eyes bulged, mirroring the desk lamp's harsh glow, like a figure from some twisted noir comic, and his grin sliced across his face wider than ever before, a Cheshire's nightmare. "Hey!" he boomed in a voice that sounded too layered, as though two James were speaking in discordant harmony. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed, or barked, rather, as I attempted to assure him everything was fine, but my voice betrayed me, warping as distorted echoes in a cavern of madness. I knew I had to leave, every fiber of my being screamed that much. I couldn't risk anyone else noticing the paranoia, the creeping dread now curling around me like a suffocating smoke. I mumbled something about an upset stomach, the lie-tasting chemical and foul leaven as I spat it out, and lurched toward the elevator. As the metallic cage descended, slow and ponderous against my racing mind, a thought occurred to me with the violence of an alien intruder. What if the elevator never stopped? What if it plunged into an abyssal trap, an endless loop of descent? I imagined the mechanics failing, cables snapping, flinging me down, endlessly down through an unknowable void. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to harness reason amidst the maelstrom, but there it was again, that drumming engine, relentless, echoing persistently behind my eardrums. The doors opened, finally releasing me into the marbled foyer that glistened slick and artificial under cold LED lights. But they weren't normal lights, rather, they emitted a dirty luminosity that twisted the expansive lobby into something unsettlingly kaleidoscopic. I half ran, half flew out, not even sure if my legs were making contact with the ground. Outside, the sky was an endless void of sepulchral clouds, denying me the solace of sun or shade. I felt a primal urge to ground myself, so I staggered to a nearby bench, an island of solidity in my swaying world. The bench seemed to swallow me whole, and I collapsed there, trying to anchor again through breath, deep, intentional, fighting against the current of panic that surged within. My mind was a whirlpool, thoughts and fears spiraling in a cyclone of consciousness that seemed irreparable, but beneath it all was a mounting claustrophobia, a fear of being trapped inside myself, forever. It could have been minutes, hours, or even days that passed as I sat there, though the logical part of me knew it was probably just 15 minutes, a cosmic joke considering how it stretched into infinity within my subjective timeline. Passers-by moved around me like apparitions, fleeting shadows who acknowledged me not with their eyes but with flickers of disregard. As reality finally began to reassert itself, or perhaps it was the come down from the GFP, the great freaking pen, I realized my heart had steadied, the worst of the hallucinations had begun to retreat, and the world resumed its mundane hues once more. I still don't know exactly what my cousin had sent me that day, whether it was meant as a perverse experiment or a clumsy mistake in potency, but it altered my perception forever, leaving in its wake an indelible scar on my psyche, a reminder that sometimes the horror isn't an external force lurking in the shadows, but rather, it is the monstrous depths within us when our minds unravel. And so, I resolved never again to partake in any unknown mind-altering experiments, for now I knew that 15 minutes was more than enough time to live an eternity in a personal hell, conjured by none other than myself. When I was 7, my older sister, Elara, showed me the first of many dark and inexplicable cruelties she would inflict upon me. It was a sweltering summer afternoon when she beckoned me into the cramped, dusty attic, her voice a sweet melody concealing venom. The moment I crossed the threshold, she shut the creaky wooden door behind us, plunging the room into an eerie dimness save for a narrow shaft of light piercing through a tiny window. Her smile was something I'd grown wary of, too wide, too bright, as if her joy fed on my discomfort. In her hand, unusually pale in the subdued light, she held a small, mushy bird, its lifeless body dangling limply. "Look what I've found," she cooed, her fingers flexing around its small frame, and I realized with a shiver that she intended me to feel its brittleness, its stillness. That was the genesis of my secret. Over the years, she became adroit at tormenting me with twisted games and errands, whispering threats I didn't fully comprehend but feared deeply enough to obey. At school, to everyone else, she was the accomplished elder sibling, the epitome of academic brilliance and extracurricular allure. At home, she was a ghost haunting my aspirations for normalcy, a predator stalking the shadows of my childhood. When I approached our parents, their belief in Elara's saintly disposition eclipsed my plea. The sharp rebuke in their eyes sent me spiraling into silence, reaffirming my position as a fluctuating variable in Elara's sadistic calculus. As the years blurred, routine encounters at home, innocuous to the unseeing, transformed into strategic ambushes, meticulously orchestrated scenarios intended to belittle, erode, seize power over me. Tripping me discreetly when relatives were over, sowing doubt in teachers' minds with those meticulous tales spun with calculated precision, each act was a ritual dissection of my spirit. Her psychological shackles tightened when she subtly started manipulating my friendships, sowing discord with an artfulness that bewildered and bruised my sense of belonging. Yet, recounting these tales, I remind myself that it was the dinner party 5 years ago, a famous crux point, that undid me. Elara, now thriving in her respectability, had gathered the family, her friends, colleagues, peacocking before them while I merely hovered by the fringes, a peripheral shadow in her well-lit world. That night, within the falsely jovial confines of our dining room, something snapped. I don't quite recall what prompted the exchange, perhaps it was the wine, or the sheer weight of her blithe omnipresence that had me confronting her. Words tumbled out, a torrent of repressed confessions, her malice, her despotism, my silent suffering, all threadbare and exposed. The room shifted uneasily, and in that spotlight, Elara's charm faltered for just a fraction of a heartbeat, a flicker of the truth. I had expected vindication, a collective understanding, yet was met with the cold eye glare of collective disbelief and suspicion. Elara, ever the master of manipulation, rode the storm with tears, ingeniously turning the tables, fashioning my breakdown as an unfortunate, unprovoked outburst. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, a melodrama of concern, with tender reassurances muting any residual doubts among our guests. For every scream for help paralyzed behind my lips, Elara had a ready, meticulously curated counter-narrative. The psychology of her tactics lay in their cunning simplicity, like a stealthy poison administered drop by drop, killing not the body but the spirit. Retreating into the folds of apology, feigned smiles stitched up my lips, grim acceptance blanketed my logic. Alone with my thoughts once more, my reality twisted inward, curled around my heart, a silent resentment I dare not nourish lest I implode. Yet tonight, a decade past that pivotal night, the shadows she's laying are no longer my shackles but my stepping stones. It started with a simple journal, idle scrawling thoughts expanded into conversations with those tethered to their own tales of malice and oddity. Strangers became allies, my whispered truths echoed in other unheard voices across boards, stories like pebbles cascading into the vast ocean of shared understanding. The irony hasn't escaped me, perhaps Elara's inadvertently given me clarity, gifting me insight into the minds of those who bask in darkness. The shadow of her legacy remains, echoing in the spaces between memory and reality as I pen these words. Not for justice or vengeance, these are aspirations for the unwounded, but for delineation, for acceptance of the void she created. So, when you ask why my sister abused me, the only solace I find nestles in the ambiguity of human capacity, beyond comprehension, beyond justification, an enigma I've learned to unravel, paradoxically, while bound tightly within its snares. I never intended to let anyone know about this, fearing ridicule, isolation, or worse, that someone might actually believe me and the implications of that belief, yet here I am, Confessing to the anonymous ether of the internet. This is the safest place I can think of for bearing my truth. I genuinely think people can read my mind. It began a few months ago when I noticed subtle shifts in my interactions with people around me. You know that feeling you get when you're being watched, the prickling awareness that someone's gaze is pressing on your skin? Imagine that, but it's not just your skin, it's your thoughts laid bare like pages of an open book. It started small. I'd think of my morning's missing keys, and my roommate would nonchalantly mention where I'd last had them, without me uttering a word. Coincidental, I told myself. But then, at work, I'd draft imaginary conversations, preparing for meetings that hadn't yet been announced, and by afternoon, those very subjects would be brought up as if my colleagues had been privy to the silent rehearsals in my head. One day, midway through an unspoken criticism of my boss's questionable attire, her face flushed, a rare hint of vulnerability, and she glanced at me, just a nanosecond too long, before nervously adjusting her collar. My heart hammered as I began tallying these instances, realizing they were far too frequent to dismiss as mere chance. A chilling realization set in that no environment was safe. My thoughts were dissected and broadcast like a radio signal everyone could tune into. I began testing it intentionally, projecting bizarre and harmless musings towards strangers, like silently screaming the word elephant in a crowded elevator, only for someone to mutter about a safari tour they once took. In another instance, standing behind a couple at a cafe, I fixated on the notion of meteorites, only for them to start a random conversation about outer space. These coincidences piled up into a tower of unsettling evidence. Panic ensued as the phenomenon grew more intrusive. People not only mirrored my thoughts but reacted to them, sometimes violently. One evening, thinking disdainfully about how my neighbor always left their garbage bags along the hallway, I was shocked to see them storm upstairs and shove those same bags into my apartment with furious mutterings about entitled people who act like they can think whatever they want about others. Sleep became a frenzied minefield of restless thoughts bleeding into nightmares where I was hunted, not for crimes committed, but for thoughts unguarded. My once sacred solitude devolved into a fearsome solitude. I tried reaching out to others, testing those I thought close to me to see if anyone would outright acknowledge this nightmare, this thing shared through our unguarded, voiceless dialogues. But attempts to deliberately clear my mind only left me blank as a canvas, for others to picture what they wanted from me. A sinister control fluttered into play, a marionette string subtly tightening. In a grotesque mockery of communication, I'd sense others prodding around in my mind, calmly breaching the vault of what should have been private, nodding in apparent satisfaction as they found and took what was needed for them. I became afraid to think anything, knowing that thinking wasn't mine anymore, forever leashed to a chorus of silent observers. Can you imagine the pure dread of trying to hold secrets so dearly, trying to remember that they too would be found whenever deemed necessary? The silent suggestions lunged through my mind, leaving home, changing names, burying myself in some corner of the world until years blurred by, realizing that thought, too, wasn't just mine. Desperation clawed at my sanity as even the consideration of escape bled through to all too curious minds. People can read my mind, this I know with a certainty that burns and freezes. Please, to any reader who comes across this, who swears this is mere fiction, spare your judgment until you've felt that cold and invasive knowing that you are no longer alone with yourself, not even in the hollows of your cranium. Every laugh that feels too knowing, every shift of an eye, is magnified into evidence that we aren't meant to be solitary creatures. They already know, they will always know, and who hears this confession may someday realize that their safekeeping of thoughts is only an illusion, as flimsy as the trust I had in those around me before the world tilted into this bleak, thought-sharing abyss. Reducing my life to a performance that wasn't asked for, where every critic and confidant remains unseen, touching my deepest fears with the intimacy only thoughts can fathom. I don't know if this is happening to others, if there's a silent epidemic of minds laid bare, judged openly but shadowed by community silence. This is more than paranoia, this is an awareness, haunting and all-consuming, beyond the self, sparking an evolution of fear. My thoughts are no longer mine, and what terrifies me is the thought that neither are yours. Sam and I had been together for 3 years when I stumbled upon the first hint of our unraveling. A routine evening, the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in shades of navy and plum. Sam was in the shower when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a notification so persistent it breached my attention as I mindlessly scrolled through social media. It was a message preview from an unknown contact, "Can't wait to see you again." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach, a leaden weight that warned me against opening it, but my fingers moved independently of my conscience, interacting with the screen to reveal a conversation steeped in intimacy and lies. It turned out Sam had an entire life I wasn't aware of, a life textured with secret rendezvous, whispers on the phone, and affectionate exchanges with someone he described as the one who truly understands me and messages he never expected me to see. My heart twisted, a visceral knot of betrayal, disbelief, and aching anger, as I scrolled through each exchange, vividly painting a picture of infidelity in my mind. Each word I read was a dagger, twisting and turning in a wound that would not close. Sam emerged from the shower, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm facade. I confronted him in a soft voice, fearing my own rage. "Who is she?" I asked, my tone steady despite the quiver in my core. For a moment, Sam's expression held genuine surprise, which quickly melted into the contrived demeanor he donned when caught out, a well-rehearsed mix of contrition and rationalization. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, averting his gaze, trying to reclaim supremacy over a script that he'd lost control of. But perhaps the most chilling part of it all was how easily he slipped into the role of the aggrieved, victimized by circumstance itself. "I was going to tell you," he claimed, a lie rehearsed down to the furrow of his brows, "but things got complicated." His words were as hollow as they were perfunctory, staining the space between us with insincerity. I wish the betrayal ended there, a transgression found, confronted, and left to flounder in the past. But Sam's treachery was a many-headed beast. A few weeks later, as I sat alone in silence, cobbling together the frayed threads of trust with flimsy determination, the police arrived at our door. "Is this a good time, miss?" the officers asked, their uniforms etched with authority and edges of concern. The question bounced around my mind like a rubber ball in an empty room. Nothing about any of this was good. The officers, a man and a woman, proceeded to unfold a narrative that was like hearing a nightmare with waking ears. Sam was wanted for questioning in connection to a fraud investigation, tied up in expensive hobbies and the kind of reckless spendings that ordinary lives cannot accommodate without consequence. Among the list of transgressions was his artful deception in siphoning funds from my savings account, our savings account, he always insisted. A pool of pooled resources evaporated under his dripping deceit. Those quiet, chilling evenings post-revelation were some of the loneliest I've ever endured. I couldn't keep the tears from coming, an incessant stream of despair that threatened to drown me in their relentless tide. I filed through his possession like a detective, no, worse, a scorned lover, each artifact of his belonging inseminated with dark secrets and untold betrayals. Samuel Worthington, the quintessential partner I'd trusted and loved, materialized as a master illusionist whose greatest trick was that he ever loved me at all. But revelations were not limited to heartbreak. Digging deeper into Sam's duplicity was like opening Pandora's box. I found envelopes filled with false documents, an old laptop that had served as a hub for networks I couldn't comprehend, yet feared for their import. The more I uncovered, the wider the scope of Sam's betrayals spanned. It was as though beneath our quite meticulously curated life lay darker labyrinthine corridors he never wanted me to find, corridors filled with echoes of past indiscretions and the uncanny scent of moral decay. Rumors spread quickly once Sam's misdemeanors became public. Our neighborhood, once a bastion of community spirit, buzzed with whispered judgments and cautionary tales. "Did you hear?" they would mutter, watching me through lowered lids. "You never really know someone, do you?" They were right, and that truth was a festering wound I lived with daily. Sam fled, the coward that he was, abandoning me to the unpleasant aftertaste of our shared history, and the cold shoulders of once friends. Days blurred into one another as I battled through legal ramifications that were mine only by association, but no less impactful. I hired a private investigator, not as an act of vengeance, but to understand who this stranger I'd loved truly was. Aided by professionals who specialized in truths brought to light from shadowy pasts, the investigator unspooled a lifetime of deception. I learned of the other aliases Sam used, identities he assumed with unsettling ease to slip in and out of boundaries society failed to recognize. His exploits spanned beyond fraud, into territories darker than I dared to imagine, predation, theft, and a misuse of trust so vile, its movie script-like quality belied its reality. Yet the louder story seemed to weave its own narrative, ink-whispering tales of deceit until Sam was more ghost than man, vanishing into obscurity as clandestine as his love was false. Friends I'd known, and who thought they'd known Sam as well, vacillated between pity and avoidance, unwilling to introduce such corruption into their pristine lives. But their cautious distance was nothing compared to the silence that followed the media attention his case attracted, when I watched talking heads deliberate over his villainy, talking as though he was no more than a plot, a scripted tale of human folly. Every mention of his name was like a stab in the side, a reminder of wounds too fresh to heal. In their wake, I became both infamous and infamous, someone known only in the margin of someone else's headline story. Alone, while screens blared his misdeeds, I internally screamed for answers that no longer mattered. In my ongoing solitude, I prepared myself to confront a reality where closure might never exist, an existence diminished by someone else's supposed love. But as I closed the book on our once happy partnership, I realized the most important chapter lay ahead. I retreated into the familiar comfort of anonymity, reclaiming corners of the life Sam had sought to dismantle. Piece by piece, I rediscovered myself amidst the rubble of his betrayals. It was a slow, unraveling journey, punctuated by brushes with intrusive memories, but forward was the only direction left to me. I told and retold my story to myself, the words losing weight with each iteration, freeing me from their grip. Sam's confession, as much a condemnation of his character as a grim realization of my own blindness, was the weapon I wielded to carve out a life shaped by unyielded resilience. And so I emerged, not unscathed, but braver in my tarnished skin, afraid still of the shadows others might cast, yet emboldened by the light I could orchestrate myself. A whisper of my story calls to me now, it is time for the closed to reopen, for the forgotten to remain as lessons branded into my soul. So, Sam, wherever you are, hear me clearly, you're a terrible person and a terrible partner. But in your selfish departure, you inadvertently taught me how to recognize strength where it lay dormant. So thank you, I suppose, for waking me up from a dream disguised as a nightmare, echoing lessons only learned through facing the dark. We were experienced hikers, a close-knit group bound by our love for the wilderness and the thrill of finding paths untrodden. Our latest expedition was to a secluded range known as Whispering Pines, a place steeped in eerie local legends. We dismissively brushed off the tales told by the old-timers at the base village, superstitions about voices carried on the wind, and shadows that slipped through the trees like living things. The first 2 days were textbook perfect, until the third morning, when Caleb vanished without a trace. It happened so quickly, so surreptitiously, that we initially couldn't believe it. We'd made camp near a pristine lake under the boughs of ancient pines, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and the distant call of a solitary owl. Caleb was always the early riser, the first to stretch his legs, usually back with fresh water and a grin before the rest of us even stirred. But by the time the sun crested the mist, and there was still no sign of him, unease began to settle in. His pack was untouched, coffee unbrewed, habits uncharacteristic of our punctual friend. After calling his name into the silence yielded nothing more than echoes, we split up into pairs to search, trying to stow away the spiraling worry that started to churn in our gut. Tessa and I headed east towards the grove where a stream cut through the woods. Our eyes scanned for broken branches, footprints, anything, but the forest seemed to have swallowed him whole. Meanwhile, Eric and Julie went west, their voices faint and distant. Hours passed, the forest closing in tighter by the minute with a strange oppressive atmosphere engulfing what normally was our playground. The land seemed to shift beneath our feet, familiar landmarks turned strange, paths doubled back on themselves impossibly, and we'd catch fleeting glimpses of movement at the edges of our vision. By the time we regrouped, the sun was low, our nerves taut. Eric was unusually quiet, a shadow crossing his face as if he had caught the scent of something ominous. Julie's attempt at levity was stilted, cracking under tension as she joked weakly that maybe Caleb had just gotten cold feet and headed home. Night fell sharp and sudden, with a chill that had us drawing closer to the fire we'd built out of necessity rather than comfort. Whispering Pines had developed an auditory personality, soft sighs and an occasional haunting rustle that felt unnervingly personal. Just when weariness began to drag at our eyes, an all-too-familiar voice called out faintly from the woods. Caleb's voice. Relief washed over us, instinctively pulling us to our feet. But Tessa grabbed my arm, halting me with wide eyes. "Listen," she whispered urgently. The eerie note in that familiar call was undeniable. A quiver in the cadence that touched on something old and primal, something we shouldn't have been able to hear. Eric, putting on a brave face, called out, assuring Caleb we would come to get him, but just beyond the ring of firelight, where the trees loomed like great dark sentinels, Caleb's voice echoed again, hollow and wrong. We sat, paralyzed by instinct screaming that something wasn't right, until all at once, the voices stopped, leaving us stranded in deafening silence. Sleep was impossible that night as every creak and crack seemed amplified, each whisper of the branches sounding suspiciously like someone sneaking closer. Hours dripped by agonizingly slow, and by dawn's pallid light, we resolved to retrace our steps back to the village for help. Navigation was inexplicably difficult this time, the forest a labyrinth that delighted in confusion. What trails remained unblocked taunted us with surreal disorientation, We should have reached civilization by midday, yet we only stumbled deeper into this natural maze. Then, on the supposed path home, we found Caleb's compass smashed, reflecting the dull glow of the dismal sky, a chilling homage that rooted us in dread. Desperation clawed at our minds, whispering dark desires of distrust and fear, as if this forest sought to unravel the threads binding us together. The final day blurred into night again, an eternal twilight under the canopy. We clung to each other not out of camaraderie but for fear of becoming the next to vanish. As we huddled together, we debated not just the real horrors of exposure and dehydration, but the lurking terror of Caleb's voice, which now returned, mocking, shifting timber as if trying on skins. Eric, eyes wild with fraying sanity, claimed the trees whispered to him, claimed they knew the paths and the terrible fate that would keep us here. Julie begged him to stay silent, to not acknowledge whatever had taken Caleb, lest it finds us suitable replacements. A storm rolled in after midnight, thunder roaring a twisted lullaby while wind howled through the branches, drowning out even our panicked voices. As lightning illuminated the surroundings, we saw silhouettes within the trees, figures that mirrored those who had gone missing in these woods years before, if village lore was to be believed. Tessa clutched my hand with a grip so fierce it spoke of unvoiced terror, and when dawn arrived again, in hues now tinged with the surreal shift of reality, we stumbled upon a small clearing none of us remembered seeing. There, center-focused in stark contrast to the vibrant grass was Caleb's water bottle, its presence a sinister beacon marking our passage from the known into the inexplicable. We never saw Caleb again. When we reached the village, looking like specters, babbling about what we had endured, dismissive eyes met our desperate tales. They wrapped around us, the comfort of civilization, but could not chase away the creeping realization that those woods wanted something, needed something, and our presence had fed its hunger in a way none of us could articulate. The stories told in whispering tones in the bars and around campfires now held new weight in our hearts, for we had left a piece of our sanity there, among the whispering pines, and it would call us back, in the form of Caleb's voice, until the end of our days. When I decided to take a gap year as a sort of find-myself journey, I had no idea it would nearly lead to my demise. My friends and family were supportive, albeit skeptical, when I announced I'd be spending over 200 days off-grid, trekking through a remote forest preserve in Eastern Europe. I wanted to disconnect from society, escape the crushing pressures of university life, and hopefully, come back with some clarity about my future. With a hefty pack and an outdated map, I set off, blissfully ignorant of the horrors that awaited. Initially, the isolation was invigorating. The forest was an expanse of untouched beauty with towering trees whispering secrets in the wind, their leaves performing an elusive dance. I relished the solitude and the primitive joy of relying on nature's offerings. But nature, I found, has little empathy for naivety. My days flowed with the rhythm of the forest, until one evening when I stumbled upon an anomaly, a narrow path diverging from the main trail. It wasn't marked on my map, not surprising, given its age, but something told me, I know it sounds insane, that it led somewhere important. I was drawn to it, an impulse as irrational as it was undeniable, and so, I veered sharply from my planned path onto this uncharted one. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became. Vines hung like nooses from the trees, thickening into a near impenetrable wall, and the terrain seemed to steepen with every step. I half chuckled at the idea that this felt like entering another world. That night, I camped in a clearing beneath an unsettlingly full moon. As I lay alone in my tent, its fabric thin and fragile against the night's chill, I heard a sound, a low, guttural hum, not unlike a swarm of bees, circling the perimeter of my camp. I chided myself for my fear, attributing it to mere fatigue and nerves. But it persisted, growing louder, until I was sure it was right outside the tent. Holding my breath, I lay paralyzed with dread until the first light of dawn. When I emerged, the forest was still, almost suspiciously so, and the markings on the ground where the earth seemed scratched, not by animals, but by something with intent. A rational person would have turned back, but I had convinced myself this was the type of perilous ordeal that would define my journey. Continuing deeper, the forest seemed to react to my increasing unease. Paths shifted behind me as if being erased. It was on the 75th day when I found the village, or what was left of it. Charred remnants of huts clung to the earth like ancient corpses, ashes swept away by relentless winds. A sense of wrongness settled in my gut. Still, a twisted curiosity pulled me forward, towards the only intact structure, a chapel, its stone facade oddly preserved amidst the decay. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, disturbing decades of dust. Inside, unlike typical chapels illuminated by stained glass, This one was devoid of light save for a singular window depicting an apocalyptic scene, an artist's vision of humans entwined in vines, their faces contorted in anguish. Then I noticed the altar, if it could even be called that, a series of stones arranged in a circle, at its center, a bowl of tarnished silver. Mesmerized, I stepped closer, horrified to see it filled with what looked like thick, coagulated blood. My instinct screamed to flee, but my feet were rooted by an inexplicable force. Just then, from the shadows, emerged a figure, impossibly gaunt as though sculpted from nightmares. Its eyes bore into mine, capturing my soul in an icy grip. It didn't utter words, it didn't have to. Its presence was an entire language of terror. I recoiled, stumbling back, and heard a sickening crack beneath my feet, bones protruding from the soil like forgotten relics. Panic surged, I ran, not stopping until my lungs screamed for air. Weeks turned into a blur of survival, each night haunted by the inescapable hum, no longer bees but a symphony of whispers, always around me, questioning, accusing. I ran out of food first, then hope, roaming the forest that had become a hellish labyrinth. On day 200 by my reckoning, I collapsed from utter exhaustion, half dreaming of hands reaching from the earth, pulling me into their grave. I woke to the sound of voices, human voices, rescuers who'd been alerted by a hiker who found my abandoned tent. I was saved, or so they believed. Even home now, surrounded by life's comforts, sleep evades me. Every creak of wood, every flutter of the curtains, revives the whispers. Friends ask what I discovered during my hiatus from the world. I laugh it off, telling them stories of scenic vistas, omitting the village, the creature, and the sound. But those mysteries are embedded in me, a shadow looming beneath my skin. The gap year was meant to be a peaceful departure from reality, a journey inward. Instead, I wandered too far into the realm where reality becomes a doorway to nightmares, and I feared that what I found, or what found me, might still be lingering just out of sight, one step back into the woods waiting for the inevitable call of the hum. I never meant to hurt my sister, Rachel. We were always close, two peas in a pod, until I became entangled in a chilling web of secrets. You see, Rachel has always been a free spirit, with endless hobbies and little regard for rules. When she moved into our grandparents' old house, I thought it was perfect for her, a quaint, rustic place on the edge of a small town. But I started worrying when her visits and calls became rare, her cheerful chatter replaced by vague excuses. I was skeptical, sure, but naive enough to brush it off. What could possibly go wrong in such a sleepy town? That was until I found a diary tucked beneath her favorite armchair during one of those rare visitations. It was stained, yellowed, its pages filled with a frantic scrawl I barely recognized as Rachel's. Late one night, curiosity overpowered my guilt, and I read. Her entries were chaotic, spiraling narratives about strange rituals and cryptic symbols. Mentions of someone she called the Keeper and weekly meetings at twilight urged an immediate shiver down my spine. I knew Rachel was dabbling in something perilous, her careless whispers of faith and unseen creatures now heavy with ominous foresight. Desperate to help, I searched her house for clues while she was out. The attic revealed eerie artifacts, bones strung into ornaments, jars filled with an inky black substance. They reeked of decay and something else, something more foreboding. My heart raced as I uncovered a room filled with twisted dolls, their eyes replaced with polished stones, and shackles bolted to the walls. I realized the insanity had roots deeper than I imagined. One evening, I followed Rachel to one of her meetings by hiding in a thicket across her house. Shadows moved unnaturally in the moonlight, figures encircled a pit emitting acrid smoke that twisted into dreams capable of trapping even a skeptic like me. Chanting echoed through the trees, the Keeper's voice, a guttural entity ancient and malevolent, commanded her every move. They were making sacrifices, not of animals or any benign offerings expected from old tales, but something way more sinister. I believe they were cultivating fear, feeding on energy gathered through these abhorrent acts. Understanding that the authorities would never believe this without more tangible proof, I stole Rachel's journal, every vile artifact I could carry, and a camera loaded with incriminating images. I couldn't sleep after, knowing she'd notice the theft and react unpredictably. My sleep was snatched by whispers weaving sinister tales and visions of Rachel tangling herself in something unspeakable. Days blended into nights as I wrestled with my decision, lost in the moral dilemma of preserving her freedom versus respecting her autonomy. It was Rachel being clumsy and impulsive that she had stumbled upon something larger, darker than herself. One night she called, her voice charged with dread. "I know what you've done," she hissed, "and now they're coming for you." Her words buzzed with a resonance far larger than the phone lines carrying them. There was no safety net, no one to believe what I had to say. As I hung up, the lights flickered, and my world plummeted into darkness, punctuated only by distant chants that seeped under doors and through walls, circumnavigating locks and no signs. A pungent mist filled my space, urging me to question reality as dawn crept closer. I felt pursued, surveilled, thumps under the floorboard, breath at my neck, hands I couldn't shake reaching from spaces never meant for human touch. I knew she wouldn't stop until she silenced me or pulled me into whatever profane covenant she believed herself tethered to. But this was bigger than us, transcending sibling loyalty. It wasn't just about Rachel anymore, it was about freeing her from the binding choice, the same one she made through ignorance or thrill. I didn't care if she would end up in jail, if they lauded me villain, or if she cursed my name forever. I had to act. I packaged her evidence meticulously and delivered it to every relevant authority, desperate to sever the infernal ties. My final visit to our grandparents' house before bolting town was like walking into a moi. The house felt alive, absorbing light and warmth into a chilling coldness, shadows coagulated in spaces that once embraced peace. She was waiting for me, not with anger, but a weary resignation. "It's too late," she murmured. Behind her eyes, I glimpsed the truth, a sadness older than time, swallowed by its own void. I drove away, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror like a bad dream half remembered on waking. I hope they forgive me someday, those whose lives intertwine with ancestors' secrets, sold to preserve realities beyond their ancestral beings. So, what must I consider? Am I the idiot for meddling, delving deep where I had no sworn oath, or untangling the chains threatening to devour what little spirit remained of my sister? Last year, during a road trip to clear my mind after a rough breakup, I found myself driving through a sparsely populated area of western Tennessee. It was late afternoon, and as I sped past miles of empty fields and dense forest, a flickering neon sign caught my attention: Mildred's Diner. I was famished and grateful for its existence, though something about the place felt slightly off. It sat at a crossroads, as if trapped between time, with a faded silver facade that mirrored the setting sun. There were no other cars outside, but the open 24 hours sign glowed with a welcoming promise of comfort food. My first step inside was odd. The air felt curiously dense, thick with the smell of fried food and apple pie, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet. The interior was like walking into a postcard from the 1950s, the kind so preserved you'd think it was artificial. An elderly waitress, whose name tag read Doris, loomed behind the counter, her expression caught between a forced grin and a boredom etched over decades of serving strangers. I hesitated, but hunger outweighed my apprehension. As soon as I sat in one of the booths, Doris shuffled over with a menu. Her voice was a rasping whisper, almost drowned out by the buzzing of an old jukebox in the corner playing some forgotten rock and roll tune. I ordered a cheeseburger and a vanilla malt, feeling cliché succumbing to what was probably their signature dish. As she retreated to the kitchen, I scanned the room, noticing the absence of any other patrons despite the plethora of empty tables. Just then, the light flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadowy figure standing by the door. But when I blinked, it was gone, leaving me unsure if it had ever been there. Nervously, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light or my fatigued mind. While waiting, I glanced around at the photographs on the walls, snapshots of seemingly happy people enjoying meals, but with an eerie similarity, their smiles, upon closer inspection, looked more like grimaces. I felt an odd chill and brushed it off as my imagination. The food arrived quicker than expected. Doris placed the burger and malt in front of me with that same unsettling half-smile. The smell was incredible, enough to push aside my misgivings. The first bite was heavenly, the beef was juicy, the bun perfectly toasted, decadence on a plate. But as soon as I swallowed, an odd sensation unfurled in my stomach. It churned aggressively, a boiling anger threatening to rise into my throat. I tried to mask my discomfort, not wanting to show weakness in front of the watchful gaze of Doris, who hadn't moved from the counter, her eyes piercing. By now, the daylight outside had completely faded, and only the harsh fluorescent bulbs above battled the encroaching darkness. On instinct, I took another bite, the act mechanical, like my body demanded it despite the growing nausea. Then it happened. The room blurred for a moment, like a camera. Refocusing, and I noticed the previously absent patrons, each sitting at different booths, silent and staring directly at me. My heart kicked like a trapped rabbit, but my body refused to move. Their faces were unnaturally pale, eyes hollow, as if they'd been drained of life. I blinked again in disbelief, they vanished, leaving behind only unease. Panic licked at the edges of my consciousness. I stood abruptly, knocking over the malt which spilled across the table like melting ice cream guts. Doris, still standing, didn't react, but her eyes flicked slightly toward the plate. "Takeaway?" she suggested coolly, her voice now inexplicably resonant in the enclosed space. I declined clumsily, tossing a crumpled bill from my pocket on the table and stumbling toward the exit. Outside, the air was cool, but no less oppressive. The diner seemed to emanate a lingering heaviness. With every step towards my car, the sensation of being watched grew louder, pulsing in my temples. Once inside, I drove off hastily, eager to leave whatever madness haunted that crossroads. Minutes down the road, an involuntary glance in the rearview mirror revealed the diner illuminated not by the billboard's harsh lights but a pale, spectral glow. I shivered, speeding away, dignifying it with no second looks, chasing the notion that in distance I'd find safety. Several hours later, well past midnight, in my motel room, it began. A terrible pain shot through my abdomen, the kind that demands attention, bending me double. The terror of that moment eclipsed logical thought. Morning brought slight relief but unveiled a ghastly discovery: my reflection in the small bathroom mirror was foreign. My complexion had drained to that same unearthly pallor seen in those ethereal patrons. Memories of them flashed in my mind, and panic scratched under my skin, relentless. Desperate, I searched online for any clue, any mention of Mildred's diner. There were no listings, reviews, or even anecdotal evidence of its existence. It was as if it vanished from reality, leaving only the lingering dread that stalked me since. I wish I had never eaten at that diner, never stopped, never succumbed to the gnawing hunger. But some choices, once made, cling to you, altering fate irreversibly. Now, each night, I see them in my dreams, the spectral diners, their mournful eyes staring, waiting, and every morning my reflection fades a little more. I fear soon, I'll become one of them, another ghostly diner, eternally hungry, forever trapped in a place that doesn't exist, haunting unsuspecting travelers who will wish they had never eaten at that diner. Last week, I stood under the gentle cascade of autumn leaves, amidst the flickering candlelight and the solemn faces of loved ones, when the gentle hum of my dream wedding spiraled into a living nightmare. My best friend, Dana, a renowned wedding planner with an eye for detail that could put Martha Stewart to shame, had promised me the fairy tale event, and up until that moment, she had delivered. But unbeknownst to her and lurking in the shadows was her new assistant, a pale young woman named Elise, whom Dana had vouched for but I barely knew. The day had begun splendidly: crisp air, the smell of jasmine lingering from the bouquets, and the soft notes of the cello resonating through the garden. Every petal was in its place, every strand of fairy light illumination was perfect, Dana's magic at work, as always. But it was during the vows, just as I peered lovingly into my partner's eyes, that I first noticed something off. Elise, creeping just at the edge of our peripheral vision, was adjusting something behind the altar, too fixated on a task I hadn't delegated, with an unsettling intensity. Out of nowhere, the air shifted. Guests shifted uncomfortably as a cold breeze swept the venue, despite the stillness of the mild October day. Then, an eerie change in the music, a subtle shift from harmonic to discordant, an unnervingly seamless blend into a melody that was as haunting as it was unplanned. Heads turned, whispers rose, but Elise seemed the only one unfazed, still fidgeting with something in her hands. The officiant hesitated, but continued as if nothing had happened, which was our cue to complete our vow just as strange shadows played across the aisle, twisting unnaturally in the flickering candle glow, all seeming to pivot around Elise's movements. My unease turned to dread, yet I pursued the thought that this could just be a series of unfortunate but benign coincidences. After all, Dana had never failed me before. But it was only the beginning. The reception, held in a tent on the long-stretching lawn of the estate, was where things turned truly bizarre. The structure Dana had so carefully curated had transformed. The elegant draping now appeared ragged, as if some unseen fury had clawed at them. The tables, set with immaculate precision moments ago, sat in disarray. I glanced at Dana, who was in a flurry of focused calm, reassuring guests, her placid exterior unwavering, while Elise moved with airy purpose behind her. Dessert service marked the moment of no return. Guests took bites of a cake that differed from the one Dana and I had selected, a confection that tasted of ash and left a bitter, earthy grit. Then the lights flickered, the sound system erupted in a mechanical screech, and the tent's entrance seemed to billow as if it were breathing. My heart raced as I stood paralyzed, the laughter of friends morphing into unsettling cackles that echoed in my ears long after they faded with the dying lights. It was then I saw Elise again. Standing too still, her eyes flicking across the room until they locked onto mine. In that gaze, I saw malice, pure, unmasked malice, and an unexpected familiarity as if I should have recognized her. It was more than a prank, More than a shift in atmosphere, this was personal. Retreating to gather my thoughts, I stumbled upon Elise's small leather journal tucked at the back of the tent, dropped in haste. Hesitant, I opened its pages, unearthing a series of sketches, the layout of my wedding, twisted and darkened with scribbles, symbols, and frantic notations of names, dates, and an unsettling history of unfortunate events traced back to Dana's past weddings, each an anomaly linked to increasingly bizarre and unexplainable happenings. I returned to the tent, breath short and ragged. Confronting Dana felt like betrayal, but withholding the truth felt like complicity. As the night wore on, I argued internally, watching guests leave, faces drawn and confused, unspoken tension heavy on the air. Finally, the moment could be postponed no longer. Dana stood radiant in the aftermath, assuring us all of the beauty of the night, her relief palpable. But I could not let the apparition between us linger without voicing what I knew. So, with measured hesitation, I approached her, the journal clutched like a talisman. Before I could start, Dana began, "I hope you're happy, truly." Her sincerity made the confrontation more cutting, my confession looming with a weight that had grown heavier with every ticking second. "Dana," I started, my voice trembling, "we need to talk about Elise." Her face darkened not with anger, but with a shadow of fear, one that mirrored my own experiences of the day. What happened next unfolded a history I had not expected. Dana revealed that Elise hadn't been vetted fully. She had appeared in Dana's life shortly after responding to an ad amidst a pile of unimpressive resumes, written off as just another assistant trying to break into the industry. There wasn't time for proper introspection, a decision Dana now regretted deeply as Elise's presence brought with it an air of foreboding not just to my wedding but others before mine, where mysterious omens began, stories of vows twisted in jest, cakes imbued with the forgotten flavors Elise seemed to harbor. In hushed tones, Dana explained she had noted similar disturbances but felt trapped by Elise's unsettling charm and exceptional skill at calming chaotic episodes, which always seemed to implicate her somehow, holding an unsettling power to weave sanity into despair. Elise was nowhere to be found. Her belongings had vanished, and with them any hopes of confronting her, leaving only the cryptic remnants of the journal as a testament of her interference. In that chilling aftermath, Dana and I shared more than an occupational bond, a new understanding of the darkness unexplained that Elise carried, enshrouded in a facade of diligent work. And as we parted that night, a whispered question loomed: would I truly be the asshole if I told Dana? Or was speaking up about the assistant not just telling a truth, but setting us free from whatever phantom shadows followed Elise's trail, determined to turn joy into discord and unity into isolation? The question, hanging heavy with implication, lingered uncomfortably between us as Dana nodded silently, a silent understanding passing, one that perhaps, if shared, might save others from Elise's yet uncertain malevolence. The shadows in my family grow long and twisted as I recall the last time I defied them, choosing solitude over so-called familial unity, flaking on what they called a family vacation that ended up being a descent into something I can barely comprehend. It started when my parents, with their forced smiles and travel brochures spread across the kitchen table, announced a getaway to some remote cabin deep in the woods. Their enthusiasm was palpable, but so was the underlying urgency I couldn't place, as if this vacation was less about relaxation and more about ritual. I had my plans, work deadlines piling up, and frankly, the idea of a cabin retreat without cell service seemed more isolating than de-stressing. You don't say no to my family, not unless you want to deal with the cold disdain of being that child who ruined things. My older sister, Mara, immediately jumped on board, her eyes glinting with excitement that felt more feigned than genuine. I held my ground, stating firmly that I wouldn't go. "Am I the asshole for wanting to stay home?" I asked, hoping for some show of support, but instead received the usual side eyes and muttered agreements that family is everything. Surprisingly, the trip went on without any further protest from them, and as they packed up the old SUV, an eerie silence fell over the house that seemed to echo with an absence rather than tranquility. For the first time, I was alone in the family home, basking in what I thought would be a peaceful reprieve. However, the quiet soon became oppressive, a buzz in the back of my mind that kept reminding me of countless unsaid things. On the third night of their absence, my phone buzzed repeatedly, texts from Mara. Her messages were garbled, almost as if they'd struggled through layers of static, but the fragments I managed to piece together painted a chilling atmosphere. "Something is wrong here, not what it, Mom and Dad, strange rituals." The words dissolved into incoherence. Chilled by the cold grip of unease, I tried calling but the calls always failed. No service, no connection, just a mocking beeping. I took to social media, seeking normalcy, or perhaps distraction, but instead, I found something far more unsettling. Posts from friends, acknowledging my family's trip, asking why there was something off about the pictures Mara posted. I hadn't accounted for social media. She had uploaded photos that at first glance seemed typical: trees, a lake, our parents, but a closer inspection clutched my heart with an icy hand. The eyes of my parents seemed vacant, the smiles stretched too thin, twisted at odd angles like they were forced wide open, and there was something else in the background of those serene forest images, dark figures, obscured by trees, yet undeniably omnipresent. Heart hammering in my chest, I messaged my friend Alex, someone grounded enough not to dismiss my growing panic. He agreed to drive to the cabin, located about 5 hours outside the city, the longest, most tension-riddled drive of my life. Upon arriving, an oppressive stillness hung over the surroundings, blending perfectly with the approaching dusk. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, and I found my family's SUV parked but oddly crooked, keys still in the ignition. Every instinct screamed, urging me to turn back, but Mara's incomplete messages were a beacon pulling me forward. The cabin door swung open with an eerie creak that shattered the silence like glass. Inside, it appeared abandoned in haste, bags haphazardly thrown, a chair toppled over. It was then Alex noticed something taped to the wall, photos, dozens of them, depicting what looked like a celebration, masks, torches, and those scarcely dressed figures from Mara's photos, enacting what appeared to be ancient rituals right here in the supposedly serene cabin. The final shot made my heart stop, Mara front and center, surrounded by these strangers. Her eyes screamed of fear and betrayal, as if she knew her place as scapegoat in some unholy rite. I stumbled back, nausea rising. We had to find them. Just as panic set in anew, the forest outside seemed to awaken, distant chanting carried by the night breeze. Our flashlights cut through the darkness in slicing ribbons, each movement not revealing what we sought but rather heightening the shadow's grasp. Eventually, we stumbled upon a clearing where the site close to insanity lay bare, a circle of shadowy figures with Mara at the center, dazed, a crown of thorns atop her head, eyes flickering between terrified awareness and hallucinatory submission. My parents stood among them, faces eerily calm, void of recognition as I called out. My voice, a desperate echo swallowed by the forest, broke whatever ritualistic trance held them. For a moment, reality seemed to shudder, vibrating between ancient impulses and modern consciousness. The followers, once shadows, dissolved into the darkness, leaving only my family, visibly shaken and confused, as though waking from a nightmare. The morning came harsh and surreal, colors too bright, yet the night's horrors refused to fade. No one spoke on the ride back, the air thick with unspoken agreements never to speak of this, to question what indeed happened, what we had become a part of, knowingly or not. As days turned into weeks, I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, especially during twilight, where the setting sun made the shadows long and twisted once again, reminiscing of their untold rituals. And every so often, a garbled text from Mara would arrive, warning, or perhaps reminiscing, "It's not what it seems, always watch." Now, when friends ask why I didn't join the family vacation, I just give a wan smile and change the subject. Do they think I'm the asshole for skipping out? Perhaps. But deep down, a haunting part of me whispers that I narrowly escaped something only hinted at in my nightmares, and as shadows stretch long, I wonder if it was truly by choice, or some darker, primordial calling thwarted only by my absence. If you're reading this, it's likely because the bizarre events of last night have left me questioning reality itself. It all began with what seemed like a mundane family dinner at my parents' house, a familiar and comforting setting where the warmth of my mother's cooking typically wrapped everyone in a cocoon of safety. We had gathered to celebrate my father's birthday, a man whose only claim to fame within our family was his obsession with perfecting his lasagna recipe, a task he considered akin to an artist creating a masterpiece. The kitchen table was set with the usual fanfare, a glinting feast of layered pasta, rich sauces, and gooey cheeses that clung to one another like secrets held between close friends. As my family chatted noisily around the table, I felt a sudden itch for something different, a spark of rebellion in an otherwise harmonious evening. I reached for the forgotten bottle of hot sauce nestled inconspicuously at the end of the table. It was an impulse, a reckless urge for spiciness to break the monotony, like that tingling desire for a thrill to disrupt a peaceful night's sleep. As I dabbed that fiery elixir onto my slice, I was blissfully unaware that my small act of culinary rebellion would open a door to something far beyond human comprehension. At first, the room seemed to continue as it always had, filled with the lilting tunes of conversation and laughter echoing against the walls. But as I took the first bite, The spice tingled against my taste buds with a pleasurable intensity that was almost narcotic. That euphoric moment lasted only seconds before the atmosphere around me shifted, like a scene in a play where the actors forget their lines. My family's voices drained away into a distant hum, like a radio losing signal, and the room began to stretch and twist around me, pulsating with shadows that flickered in rhythm with my escalating anxiety. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, a rhythmic drum marking the entrance of a creeping dread that clawed its way up from the pit of my stomach. My father's usual jovial face now seemed to hang on his skull like the ill-fitting mask of a stranger, and as I glanced at the other end of the long dining table, where I expected to see my sister's cheeky grin, an overwhelming darkness loomed instead, a void where her familiar presence used to radiate warmth. Concealed within that void was a whisper, an incomprehensible murmur that rasped with the urgency of a forgotten nightmare. It spoke in a language my conscious mind couldn't decode, yet my soul understood perfectly, translating the chills that danced across my spine into a primal panic I couldn't shake. I turned, desperately seeking allies in this surreal battle against the unseen, yet when my eyes fell upon my parents and siblings, they were locked in place, eyes unblinking and vacant, as if they'd been pitched into a trance. I was alone in a room of statues, eerie replicas of my family, and from within those glassy eyes radiated an inexplicable awareness, an understanding that they were part of something I couldn't perceive, a dark reality lurking just beneath the veneer of my existence. Suddenly, I rose from my seat, driven by a primal instinct to flee but simultaneously chained by the irrational belief that leaving would condemn me to a fate I was not ready to comprehend. My eyes darted back to the plate of lasagna now turned cold and daunting, an artifact from the reality I had so thoughtlessly left behind with one impulsive act. And then came the laughter, not the mirthful sound of joyous celebration, but a guttural, echoing cackle that seemed to bubble up from deep within the earth itself. It reverberated through the walls, shaking the family photos until they hung askew, and with each laugh, the shadows in the room grew bolder, more tactile in their malice. They danced around me, taunting silently in a ballet of darkness that told me nothing and everything all at once. Was this madness a punishment for my culinary indifference, or was the universality of hot sauce simply an awakening, an unsealing of doors meant to remain shut tight? I staggered back from the table, my retreat halted only by the chill of the wall against my back as I sank onto the floor, hands pressing against my temples in a futile attempt to block out the resounding madness. But it was not until a hand, one lifelessly cold and unexpected, grasped my shoulder with an unforgiving strength that I realized I wasn't alone in my terror. A presence loomed behind me, indistinct yet real, its breath freezing the air upon my neck, whispering a mockery of existence itself as the real words it spoke slipped beyond my grasp like water through clenched fists. "Do you see now?" It whispered, each syllable a serrated edge slicing through my sanity. "Do you see the truth of what you dared to taste?" I dared not answer, could not breathe under the weight of its ancient, unfathomable malice. With a final surge of defiance, I twisted away, breaking free from its grip only to find myself back at the table, surrounded again by the pretense of family and comfort. They were talking as if nothing had occurred, as if reality had snapped seamlessly back into place, a twisted reminder that perhaps I had never left it. I stared numbly down at the heap of lasagna on my plate, the hot sauce now entirely absorbed into its folds, hinting at no evidence of the supernatural calamity it had unleashed. My family resumed their chatter, unaware of the dim specter of terror that had passed through our lives like an undetected virus. But within me lingered a dread I could neither shake nor explain, a seed of doubt in the fabric of what was real. Desperate, I shoved the lasagna away, the lingering smell of heat and spice curdling in my nostrils as I wondered if I'd summoned something that would never quite release its hold. I knew then that my life would never slip back into the comforting monotony I craved, that every echoing laugh and flickering shadow would forever carry the weight of that unspeakable presence. And as I bid my family goodbye, driving home through the night, I could almost see its eyes in the shadows cast by the streetlights, hear its insidious whisper in the rustling trees, reminding me that I can never escape what I'd tasted, annihilation sealed by the simple dip of lasagna into hot sauce. It was just another Saturday evening, and the craving for greasy, cheesy goodness crept over me like a comforting, yet unshakable presence. The neighborhood pizza joint, Tony's Slice of Heaven, was renowned for its Chicago-style deep dish pizzas, and I'd been salivating over the idea of their signature creation all week. At 7 p.m. sharp, I made the call. "Large deep dish, extra cheese, loads of pepperoni," I said, hearing the boredom in the kid's voice who took my order. His monotone confirmation and estimated time for delivery seemed off, 45 minutes instead of 15, suspicious for a place 5 minutes down the road. Time dragged heavily as I waited, stomach growling, mind daydreaming about the perfect blend of flavors and textures. The delivery was late, of course, an hour and a half late. It's hard to express the kind of hunger rage you develop when you start out very hungry and end up starving while just waiting. When the doorbell finally rang, I didn't care to check the peephole, assuming it was the teenage delivery driver, apologies rehearsed and payment calculator ready. Instead, I opened the door to a void of silence with no one in sight, until a box was slowly pushed through the entrance. At first, I thought it was a prank until I noticed a dank smell wafting from the dark hall. It didn't smell like food, more like wet earth. Phone flashlight in hand, I peeked into the hallway. No one. My building's corridor was empty, the lights flickering as if protesting their exposure to someone, or something, unexpected. I quickly closed the door, rationalizing it was just a joke, after all, a tired delivery boy pulling a fast one on hangry customers. Immersed in pizza fantasy, I returned to the box, opened it, and recoiled at the sight. The pizza was there, kind of. It seemed raw and lived in, bearing an odd consistency that could only be credited to neglect or sabotage. There, right in the middle of the coagulated cheese, sprawled a peculiar symbol etched in marinara, like some cryptic calling card. I tried to look closer, neglecting my initial revulsion. I should have known better. Each string of cheese lifted, each bite taken, felt off, otherworldly. It coated my insides with a queasiness that wasn't purely physical. Ignoring my instincts, I kept eating, hating myself and loving every illicit bite. Minutes later, a sharp knock interrupted my meal. It was a man, sweating, eyes wide open as if they'd seen too much. "You didn't pay," he panted. "You ordered, but you forgot." I fumbled incoherently for an apology and a tip out of habit, thrusting a handful of change at him. Oddly, a single nickel and 5 pennies were jammed into my palm. It felt innumerably rude and disproportionate for a $70 bill. His eyes, dark and sunken, peered into mine, devoid of forgiving, just two vast, emotionless pits. He accepted the coins and left, grumbling words I couldn't comprehend but felt immediately fearful of. As soon as he staggered out of my line of sight, the walls creaked, the shadows stretched ominously, and a pressure built in my chest like something wanted out. Then the apartment was cold, Dallas midsummer kind of cold, and I shivered uncontrollably. I thought I heard scratching, subtle at first, almost blending with the wind that crept through the cracks of the old walls, but soon it became a cacophony of skittering, clawing against imagined surfaces. The walls seemed to breathe in rhythm with my escalating panic. Before long, whispers echoed from the corners, guttural and foreign, taunting me in dialects I couldn't marry to earth. Was it the pizza? Something buried deep bobbed to the surface, a clip from a late-night paranormal show about symbols, demonic omens, and possession. No, it couldn't be that. I, a tired bachelor of minimal ambition and maximum sloth, didn't dabble in the arcane. My life was defined by meals like these, nights like this, normal, mundane. But something was wrong. The reflection in the window wasn't me, its grin too broad, skin too pallid. The world outside was undergoing transformations I couldn't account for. I swear the air got thick with the taste of pepperoni and malice. I was overwhelmed by an outrageous sense of danger, as if some pizza-related grievance awoke an ancient malevolence now seeking compensation I couldn't afford. Numbed by unimaginable paranoia, I dared not sleep. Instead, I sat, the half-eaten slice of pizza mocking me from the box like a guilty trap. It felt like a war against self-inflicted madness, my mind weaving tales of guilt and apocalypse over a neglected tip. I spent the rest of the night huddled, eyeing the doorway, waiting for the world to resolve itself, convinced that any moment, the Shadow Man would return, claiming debts unpaid, a soul's return in kind for a 10-cent tip. I've always been fascinated by the deep and mysterious world beneath our feet. Caving was more than just a job for me, it was an obsession, a way of life that I embraced wholeheartedly. When I got the tip about an unexplored system hidden away in the remote wilderness, I was thrilled. Maps were incomplete, and local legends hinted that something unnatural resided within. I scoffed at the warnings, itching for the thrill of discovery. The entrance was an unassuming, narrow crevice that almost seemed to whisper in the faint breeze, as if beckoning me to step into its shadows. Equipped with only the essentials, helmet, headlamp, a pack of supplies, I ventured into the maw of the earth, feeling the adrenaline course through my veins in that familiar, exhilarating way. As I descended, each step further isolated me from the world above. The darkness was consuming, but my headlamp carved a narrow path of light, illuminating the moist, rough walls around me. Hours passed, the rock formations morphing into arching stalactites and jagged stalagmites that seemed to claw at my skin when I squeezed through tight quarters. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to thicken, becoming warmer and more oppressive. It wasn't long before I began to hear it, a low, distant hum, like the restless murmur of something vast and ancient. The sound, almost melodic at first, drew me further into the cave's depths, compelling me to abandon any thoughts of turning back. I became fixated, following the sound like a moth to a flame. As I moved forward, the cave began to change. The walls shifted, textured like melting wax, twisting into grotesque, almost organic shapes. Shadows danced in unnatural ways, flickering as if in sync with the digital stutter of my failing headlamp. Panic set in, but curiosity gripped me tighter. I had to know. I had to see what lay at the heart of this auditory abyss. I came upon a cavern, vast and echoing, its walls shimmering with an eerie phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with the humming. In the center of this cavern was a pit, an abyss that seemed to absorb all light and warmth, exuding a malicious, magnetic force that threatened to pull me into its heart of darkness. As I approached the edge, the ground beneath me shifted, revealing grotesque faces twisted in agony, their mouths silently screaming, eyes wide with eternal despair. My mind reeled with terror as the humming transformed into voices, a cacophony of tormented souls whispering secrets of forgotten horrors. Every instinct screamed for me to flee, but my body betrayed me, inching closer to the void. I was on the precipice, peering into an endless chasm, dizzily swaying, when I saw them, skeletal figures with burning eyes, climbing slowly towards me from the depths. Fear finally broke my trance. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. The air was stifling, heavy with an unholy presence that seemed to reach into my very soul, pulling at the strings of despair and surrender. I scrambled, crawling backward, eyes fixed on the pit as the skeletal specters clambered ever closer, their rasping whispers promising eternal torment and the cold embrace of oblivion. Somehow, adrenaline took over, propelling my body upwards through the winding corridors, the malevolent laughter of those dead souls echoing in my ears, mocking my frantic escape. Every step was torture, legs leaden and refusing to obey, fatigue clawing at the edges of my vision. I was certain I'd never escape, fearing the whispers would follow me for eternity, coiling around my mind like a demented snake. Yet, after what felt like an eternity, I finally saw it, a sliver of daylight, the sweet, saving grace of the world above. I burst out of the cave, gulping the cold air, collapsing onto the blessed solid ground, sobs racking my body as the oppressive shadows released their grip. I lay there under the sun, the trembling subsiding only slowly, the whispers fading but not forgotten. My mind was scarred, haunted by visions of that hellish landscape, where the earth opened to devour the lost, feeding on fear and despair. Back home, I tried to tell people what I had found, but the words died in my throat. A rational part of my mind questioned it all, stress, exhaustion, hallucinations perhaps, but deep down, I knew. I had peered into a place not meant for the living, a domain where darkness reigned and souls were imprisoned. Every night, I hear them whispering in my dreams, taunting me with truths I can never unsee. My passion for caving has turned to dread, for I know now that hell is not an abstract concept nor a distant realm. It is here, lurking in the forgotten corners of our world, waiting in silence to claim the curious. It started like any other bitterly cold January morning in North Dakota, the kind where the air feels like knives on your skin and the world is blanketed in a heavy, eerie silence. I awoke to the familiar realization that the overnight snow had only thickened, obscuring my driveway under a fresh, fluffy layer. Still half dazed from the remnants of a sleep that had been mostly fleeing nightmares, I stumbled out of bed, tugging on a sweater over my pajamas and slipping my feet into boots that sat lazily by the door. Our secluded cabin was far enough from the main road that if we didn't clear our path by sunrise, we risked being snowed in completely. My wife, Sarah, had been insisting we get a snowblower, like normal people, but I had always dismissed it. After all, in the quiet and chill of morning, the shoveling felt almost meditative, even cathartic. I grabbed the shovel from the precariously leaning stack of firewood outside, the only sounds in the crisp air the crunch of my boots and the occasional yawn of the wind through the trees. To be fair, I hadn't thought twice about the fact that I was out there in my pajamas. It's not like there was anyone around to see me anyway. As I started clearing the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, as if from the surrounding forest depths lay a presence both ancient and unsettling. I brushed it off as paranoia, a side effect of those dreadful recurring dreams, but the sense of being watched grew stronger by the second. I doubled my pace, shoveling with new urgency as tendrils of unease slithered down my spine. And that's when I saw it. Dark, humanoid shapes flickering in the periphery where the morning shadows stretched long and thin, their outlines shimmering as if on the edge of my comprehension. I froze, my breath catching in a plume of frost. They lingered at the edge of the tree line, just far enough to avoid distinguishing them as either human or something distinctly other. My heart pounded in my chest like a tribal drum summoning some primordial deity. I spun around wildly, searching for signs that my mind was merely playing tricks. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, though the crude words faltered as I noticed the dents in the fresh snow, perfect, circular indentations that formed a path from the forest towards the cabin's back door. Each step matched the footprints I'd seen in nightmares where the sounds of broken whispers had beckoned from the shadows. A realization swept through me, these weren't just figments of some fever dream. These were real. Involuntarily, the shovel slipped from my shaking hands, its clatter muted by the snow's embrace. Panic surged. I had to wake up Sarah, tell her about the intruders lurking at our doorstep. As I turned toward the house, the shadows converged into focus, a cloaked figure, dark and immense, blocking my retreat. It loomed impossibly, eyes, or what I assumed to be eyes, glowing with a lightless incandescence. My body refused to move, frozen in place as if the sheer weight of my terror pinned me to the spot. Suddenly, the whispering began, not one voice but a chorus, echoing from everywhere and nowhere, the language incomprehensible but stabbing through my bones with its suffocating intensity. The entity raised an appendage, a hand, and as it did, the whispers coiled into an intelligible command piercing through the noise. "Why is the child not ready?" I was swept under a wave of cold understanding. Somehow, they needed my child or someone willing, someone untainted by the knowing bred from maturity. But, God, we didn't have a child. Not yet. We'd been trying, but the miscarriages had driven Sarah to the brink. The entity seemed to feel my defiance morph into horror, its presence swelling to fill my vision until I felt my mind tipping over some abyss. And then, in a blink, it was gone, the trees standing solemnly as though nothing had ever interrupted their vigil. Heart pounding, doubts churned my sanity to dust as I raced inside, finding Sarah miraculously undisturbed by my terror. I stole a glance back through the window to the forest, where any trace of my haunting was gone. There were no silhouettes, no glowing stares, just the untouched powder of a January morning. Yet, something subtle but intangible had shifted. With each sunrise that followed, I became acutely aware of how our land felt oddly hollow, a place void of the natural sounds of the world, as if biding its time. I did what any reasonable person would. The incident was locked in the safe confines of my memory, where gusts of snow and shadows couldn't reach. But when night hushed the world beneath a cloak of darkness, the whispers returned, seeping through the cracks in my facade with sinister promises. A willing vessel, they prodded, until sleep became elusive, an enemy affording me no reprieve. Sarah began to notice my habits change, my frantic nature sharp in the clueless kind of way that picks at one's patience. I confessed about that day only partially, dismissing my paranoia with the weather and isolation. Nonetheless, anxiety pried at me, festering into an obsession each time fresh snow hinted at idle footprints. I hoped our home wasn't the anchor for whatever followed us, that if we left, we could escape. Yet, deep down, I feared it was within us, within me. The essence of what fogged my dreams seemed woven into the same veil separating sanity and consciousness. With every whispered reminder, I questioned if it was truly my choice to resist or succumb and bring forth the nameless threat into waking life, donning a mundane coat under daylight's scrutiny. The strange shapes were part of life now, familiar guests in an unwelcome abode. And the terrifying truth was gradually sinking in, the darkness didn't care if I thought myself an asshole for what I'd done, for we'd never again stand unobserved. But would anyone believe me if I said that it all arose from a morning where all I wanted was to clear some snow? When I first insisted my mom stay with me postpartum instead of rushing off to see my sister-in-law who was also due soon, it seemed like a logical request. My mother, known for her doting nature, was torn between her duties. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Our family was close, and the idea of hosting 2 newborns and 2 recovering mothers simultaneously was already a challenge. My husband, Ryan, supported the idea. After all, after years of barely seeing Mom due to her devotion to my brother, it was about time I had a chance to bond with her, especially at such a crucial moment in my life. But I had no idea how twisted things would become. Mom reluctantly agreed, and when my due date came, she was there, clutching her overnight bag and a sense of unease that only I seemed to notice. My sister-in-law, Jenna, was due a week after me, but my brother lived several states away, making simultaneous support impossible. I selfishly thought, just this once, let me have Mom to myself. The birth was a blur of beeping monitors and sterile smells at the hospital. Once I was finally holding my daughter, Aurora, in my arms, there was a peace that settled over me. Little did I know it was the last peace I'd feel for some time. Mom was a comforting presence at first, organizing meals, holding Aurora while I stumbled through the exhausting cycle of sleep and feeding. But at night, strange things began to happen. The first incident occurred 3 days after we brought Aurora home. I awoke to the feeling of someone watching me. In the dim light, I could see a figure standing in the corner of our bedroom. My heart pounded until I realized it was just Mom, staring at us from the shadows. "Mom?" I whispered, groggy and confused. She didn't respond immediately, but eventually, she turned and walked away without another word. The next morning, I questioned her about it over breakfast. I must have been sleepwalking. She laughed it off, yet a strand of unease lingered. That day, I caught her humming a lullaby I didn't recognize. It wasn't strange for her to hum, but something about the tune chilled me to the bone. Aurora, usually an angel, began crying in fits unlike her usual hunger cries. They were sharp, almost as if she was in pain. I attributed it to colic until Ryan came home early one evening and stopped dead in his tracks, listening. "What's that song?" he asked warily. Mom froze, her smile abruptly vanishing. "Just a nursery rhyme from my childhood," she answered, but Ryan, unnerved like I was, insisted he'd never heard any song like that before. The nights continued to darken. I found myself staying up longer, despite my exhaustion, just to watch over Aurora. One night, footsteps echoed down the hall, and I was drawn to the sound like a moth to a flame. I peeked out and saw Mom at Aurora's door, whispering something softly as her fingers traced the air above my daughter's crib. When she turned and saw me, her hand jerked back. "She's just so beautiful," Mom whispered breathlessly, her eyes wide and unblinking in the dim light. Something was off, and Ryan felt it too. We agreed to install a baby monitor with a camera, just to see if we could catch what was going on. What we saw the following night, though, made my blood run cold. Around 3 a.m., the feed showed Mom entering Aurora's room. She leaned over the crib, humming that creepy lullaby again, but this time, the air seemed to shimmer. As she hummed, Aurora seemed to settle, her cries abruptly cutting off, replaced by an eerie silence. But then, something unexplainable happened. Aurora began levitating a few inches above her mattress, her tiny body floating as Mom continued her song. I showed Ryan the footage immediately, and we both confronted Mom the next morning. Her reaction was unlike anything I expected. She burst into tears, pleading with us to let her continue. "It's for Aurora's own good," she claimed, but her explanations were jumbled, hysterical. To protect her from Jenna's baby, she finally confessed in a whisper. My heart dropped, the room seeming to spin. "Jenna?" I echoed, not understanding. Mom revealed that in our family, there had always been a second purpose to the lullaby, an ancient rite passed down to safeguard one child above another, but only one. I was incredulous. How could she choose one grandchild's well-being over the other? Realizing Ryan and I were resolute in stopping her rituals, Mom became frantic. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she shouted, her voice filled with a terror that made my skin crawl. It was as if she truly believed Jenna's unborn child posed an unimaginable threat. We sent Mom away, feeling haunted by her warnings, hoping things would revert to normal. But they didn't. Aurora's cries intensified, often hallucinating bursts of the lullaby floating through the air. We began hearing things, seeing flickers of movement in the corners of our eyes. I swear there were whispers in that strange language woven into the lullaby, words I didn't know yet had terrible weight. Ryan stayed up late with me, clutching Aurora, who began sprouting ominous bruises and scratches that no pediatrician could explain. One afternoon, my brother called, his voice tinged with despair. Jenna had gone into labor but something was wrong, it was too early, the baby was breech, and doctors were racing against time to keep them both safe. The line was filled with screams, my brother's, Jenna's, even the garbled cries of his newborn, ear-piercing, inhuman. Time seemed to stretch as I sat there frozen, unable to help, unable to block the sound even when I pressed the phone to my chest. Suddenly, the wailing quieted, leaving a chilling silence that vibrated between us. Then Jenna's voice, calm and distant, drifted through the receiver, like she was whispering directly into my ear. "It had to be this way," she murmured, and I hung up in horror. Before I could process what was happening, the nursery filled with a cacophony of sound, an ethereal cacophony of that lullaby woven with a chorus of voices. Something changed then, dark and unnatural. Aurora's bassinet moved of its own accord, and a figure materialized, formless but possessing an aura that made me retch. I grabbed her aura before the bassinet crushed against the crib, splintering. Ryan shouted, grabbing my arm, pulling me backward just as shadows surged towards us, growling menacingly. With Aurora in my grip, we fled the house, the chorus of the forgotten lullaby chasing us into the night. We haven't returned since. The footage we showed to whoever would listen was called a trick of the light, a corrupted file. But Ryan and I know the truth. I may have acted selfishly, demanding my mom's presence. I may have disrupted a necessary balance, igniting a series of events that were never meant to be. Now Jenna and her child are otherworldly whispers on the wind, and my once beloved mom is untraceable, leaving behind a home engulfed in haunting melodies and flickering shadows. So, am I the asshole for wanting my mother's help? Or was our need for her presence an echo in a family curse, beckoning back something that should have remained forgotten? If mistakes were made, I say they were mine to bear, but the cost, oh, the cost, is something I wouldn't wish on my darkest fears. In the eerie silence, as I hold my daughter close, I pray the lullabies don't follow us anew. Sure, here's a story inspired by the title and designed to reflect the style of r/no-sleep subreddit posts. When I first grounded my 15-year-old daughter, Lily, for coloring her hair, I never thought it would unravel into something beyond any parent's realm of experience. It wasn't even about the hair color, midnight black with streaks of violet, but more about her doing it secretly at a friend's house overnight, returning the next morning with a smirk that screamed rebellion. After all, in a small town like ours, everything drips with gossip and expectations. Though I was strict, my wife always said boundaries made children feel safe, and since her passing, I've tried to be both the anchor and the ship for Lily. But last Friday changed everything. When Lily clicked the bedroom door shut, the sharp click resonated like a countdown to an unseen climax, spiraling the mundane into the surreal. Strange things began to happen in our small, creaky house perched on the edge of the woods, a house, I might add, with a history long intertwined with whispered tales of hauntings and echoes of lost children murmured in the dead of night. The first night, I heard whispers shimmering through the walls, like the crackling static of an old radio with a twisted dial, as if the house was tuning into some otherworldly station. Chalk it up to my overactive imagination or parental paranoia, I ignored the haunting murmur in favor of a glass of whiskey. But it was hard to ignore what happened at exactly 3:15 a.m. when the power blew, plunging the entire house into absolute darkness before flickering back, a strobe effect betraying the sinister silhouettes that seemed to dance just beyond the grasp of shadows at the edge of Lily's room. I barged in, calling her name, only to find her sitting cross-legged on her bed, her hair faintly luminescent in the moon's silver glow filtering through the window. Her eyes were wide open, but disturbingly blank, like she was reading something invisible to all but her. When she spoke, it wasn't her voice, it was like several voices tangled together, speaking through her entangled threads of history and time. I swear one was my wife's soft lilt entwined among them, giving me chills. "Only boundaries that are real can bleed," she said, her mouth forming the words with unnatural precision. Moments later, she blinked, gasped, and clutched her head as if awakening from a fractured nightmare. The color leached from her hair into the room's ambient light, leaving me questioning my grip on reality. I tried calling our town's only psychiatrist, Dr. Weathers, but his office phone droned endlessly, no doubt silenced by a storm wreaking havoc on communication lines, or perhaps by the whispering conspiracy of fate itself. The dawn broke, dull and tired, as shadows reluctantly peeled off night's cloak, retreating with one lingering gaze back at us, now housed in an uneasy purgatory. Exhaustion knitted itself into the fabric of the following days as Lily seemed fine, oblivious to the nightly events, her life meshing perfectly with the humdrum of teenage existence, full of forgotten homework and secretive conversations with friends whose voices cracked with growing maturity. However, the house knew different, its sentience revealing in flickering lights and footsteps echoing in the silence when no one was there. Desperate, I dove into the town archives, chasing the paper trail of Hawkins estate folklores, where my research unveiled chilling narrative threads. Our house was built on land darkened by sacrifice and secrets, a patch of cursed earth, they said, laden with iron blood promises and twisted rituals dating back generations to settlers who claimed their progeny could harness a rare gift, a link to both seen and unseen. That realization shattered my skepticism like a dark mirror. As the third night descended, thick with an ethereal mist outside, my worst fears were realized. Lily, lure for such malignant presences, was again occupied by a fleet of voices beyond time's narrow corridor. This time she directed me outside, compelled by an unseen urge, her shadow moving with the eerie grace of something not altogether bound by the physical laws of our world. The night air bit with the sharp teeth of winter's imminent approach as we reached the old well at the edge of our property, an ancient stone gullet of earth posteriorly hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. Lily knelt and placed her hands on the stones, humming a song long forgotten, words twisted like thorns caught in a wind, yet strangely comforting in their dissonance. Her hair, silken threads of universe's tapestry, shimmered once more. The earth tremored, obedient to some clandestine summoning, and began to whisper back, an unintelligible cacophony, entangled whispers from the bones of the earth echoing with nightmarish history. I fumbled for my cell, shook it violently against the likelihood of it having mysteriously died at this perilous hour, but the lens captured an apparition gravely superimposed upon my daughter's frame, silhouettes of colonial children, streaked with otherworldly luminescence, staring with eyes that mirrored nothing but the infinite. Overwhelmed by a relentless barrage of emotions and primal fear, I reached for her, ripping her away from the edge, and as the vision faded like dissipating clouds, our house felt different, as if a titanic weight had been lifted. It was suddenly just a house again. The whispers ceased, leaving a silence thicker than the greatest cacophony I'd ever known. In time, Lily sobered from her trans-dimensional reverie, her hair finally dimming to a deep brown chestnut, a grandeur locked away perhaps for future unearthing, a family Pandora's box now closed and hidden forever. The incident forged in us a bond, an unspoken understanding of boundaries not meant to be challenged, not unless we were willing to face bleeding truths laid bare by unseen forces. We gradually mended the fracture in our relationship, the rift now sewn shut with an enforced tenderness and a vow, locked in the depth of our eyes each time her hair shone in the sun, not to disturb the roots hidden in the darkness again. So was I the asshole for grounding her? Perhaps in thoughtless diversions, but beyond, in fathoms dark, I perhaps saved us both from becoming just more whispers on the wind. When my brother Mark announced his engagement to Emily, our family was overjoyed. Emily was a pleasant enough woman, albeit with extravagant tastes, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. The trouble started when I was dragged, quite against my will, into the whirlwind of wedding planning. It was during one particular evening, under the dim glow of my living room lights, that Mark proposed the idea of me hosting the bridal shower. "It's what Emily wants," he insisted, his eyes pleading, a subtle desperation in his voice that I couldn't ignore. After some hesitation, I agreed, promising to plan a modest event. But Emily's idea of modesty turned out to be something extraordinarily different. The list of demands I received was more akin to a celebrity wedding than a pre-wedding party. She wanted an elaborate venue draped in costly silks, hors d'oeuvres prepared by renowned chefs, and a live band flown in from out of state. It was clear, even from the outset, that Emily's expectations far exceeded any rational budget. I tried to reason with Mark, outlining the financial lunacy of spending tens of thousands on a bridal shower, but he was ensnared in Emily's vision, blind to any practical concerns. So there I was, caught in a tangled web of familial obligation and financial sanity, struggling to set a boundary. Then came the chilling phone call late one night. It was Emily, her voice syrupy yet edged with steel. "I hear you're not on board with my vision," she intoned, slipping into the conversation with the grace of a serpent. I attempted to explain my stance, emphasizing the importance of practicality. At first, her silvery laughter seemed harmless, but as the conversation deepened, her tone turned sinister. She dangled my brother's affection like a carrot on a stick, insinuating that any non-compliance on my part would lead to a familial rift. I felt like I was bargaining with a fairy tale witch, where agreeing to the terms meant sacrificing something far more precious. As we spoke, the hum of static on the line grew louder, and I realized with mounting terror that Emily was not alone. Her words were interspersed with a low murmur, not quite audible, the sort of echo that sends shivers down one's spine. It was as if another presence latched onto the call, whispering in a language my ears couldn't comprehend. I was thrust into a liminal space, one foot in the rational world and the other teetering on the edge of something profoundly unnerving. Hanging up, the room seemed darker, shadows shifting in corners like silent sentinels. I shrugged it off as mere exhaustion, yet sleep eluded me that night, my mind haunted by Emily's unnerving insistence. The next morning, I resolved to stand firm, initiating a casual conversation with my family about the ludicrousness of it all. To my horror, they seemed entranced, speaking of Emily's desires as if bound by an invisible thread. Each suggestion for the bridal shower was met with enthusiasm, despite my objections being clear and logical. It was like they were charmed, their eyes glossed over with a strange fervor, Emily's will fanning the flames of their excitement. Was I the only one immune to whatever enchantment she'd cast? Desperation clawing at my insides, I ventured online, seeking advice under the guise of anonymity. The waves of virtual empathy washed over me, but a nagging sensation of being watched gnawed at my core. Several comments stood out, their phrasing familiar, the words mirroring Emily's voice. Paranoia took root, whispering that she had threads reaching into the digital ether, manipulating perceptions even online. Every night, the static-filled whispers haunted me, sometimes coming through my phone, other times while I lay, bleary-eyed, trying to sleep. Then, one particularly oppressive evening, as I sat alone, phone in hand, it buzzed with the vibration of an incoming call. Unknown number. Answering it seemed foolish, yet compelled by some unseen force, I accepted. The whispering was louder now, and unmistakably, it was Emily's voice overlaid with another, ancient and chilling. "You'll join us, won't you?" It was not a question but an expectation, a subtle coercion wrapped in charm's guise. My protest was immediate, visceral, my conviction steeled by desperation. "No, I will not," I declared into the void, shutting off the phone with trembling hands. But the room was cold, an echo of my words lingering as the air thickened with an oppressive gloom. Objects seemed to shift at the edges of my vision, and the unmistakable scent of lavender, Emily's perfume, permeated the room, a phantom presence. Days passed and reality seemed to blur, the boundary between fear and certainty dissolving whenever Emily was near. Her presence suffused my waking life with dread, an omnipresent specter manipulating my family, cast in shadows I could not dispel. Weaving in and out of conversations, she twisted truths until one night, when desperation birthed madness. A family dinner spiraled into chaos the moment I challenged her, my declaration like a spark igniting dry tinder. The others sat spellbound, their eyes reflecting the gathering storm, and as Emily spoke, her voice was a susurrus of command overriding my reality. But as her facade crumbled, beneath the elegance and allure, I glimpsed the darker truth, a hollow emptiness, an insatiable hunger cloaked in charm. Confronting her was like staring into an abyss, each moment stretching into eternity, filled with dark promises and chilling echoes. Ancestral shadows danced behind her eyes, enigmatically commanding and inextricably linked to ancient revelries I dared not fathom. That night marked the beginning of liberation, the moment I became the outcast, but a free one, a pariah holding on to frayed sanity in exchange for truth. Even though my family's derision echoed in my heart, and the ghostly whispers still lingered in the crevices of my mind, I understood, I was no longer ensnared by Emily's sinister charm. Reclaiming my own boundaries came at a price, a familial fracture, an emotional chasm, but in that sacrifice, I found salvation, a reprieve from the clutches of something unfathomably dark, submerged beneath the sheen of wedding bliss. Every story has a beginning, but what if the beginning of my story was just an illusion? I once thought I accidentally killed my wife, Mary. It was a chilly November night, the kind where the clouds veil the moon and cloak the world in a deeper darkness. We were arguing, as we often did when the days got shorter and the shadows stretched longer. The issue that night, something unbelievably trivial in hindsight, boiled to the surface until neither of us held back. The next thing I remember, she was lying at the bottom of the stairs, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes staring blankly past me. Panic-stricken, I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears, an overwhelming tide of dread washing over me as I struggled to grapple with the reality of what I'd done. I didn't call the police. I didn't really know why, maybe it was the shock, or the instinctual drive to hide one's misdeeds. For hours I paced, trying to figure out my next move, when a knock at the door froze my blood. It was the landlord, Mr. Grayson, concerned about the noise or the lack of it, perhaps. Desperation clawed at me, and in those surreal moments, I considered everything from fleeing to confessing. But upon opening the door, the strangest thing happened. Mary, or someone who was an almost perfect copy of her, walked past him into the house, as if nothing had happened. "Sorry, slipped a little, love," she laughed, her voice eerily cheerful, though her eyes restlessly flickered about, like a trapped thing seeking freedom. I stood there dumbfounded, caught between immense relief and a new kind of dread. That night, I gingerly approached her, questions stuck in my throat. She acted normal, meticulously folding laundry, humming a tune I didn't recognize. But something was deeply off. It was in the details, how her clothes were slightly different, how she seemed to remember things that never happened, while forgetting others that did. The nagging questions I buried soon grew into a compulsion I could no longer ignore. The next day, I called her parents hoping they could assure me that all was well, but to my utter horror, they claimed they never had a daughter. The phone call ended with laughter, the kind that chilled my spine, as if they were part of some cruel joke. Attempting to regain some sanity, I visited our marriage counselor, collecting proof of her existence. He looked perplexed, flipped through his records, yet found no Mary under my name. Instead, he handed me a photo of myself sitting alone, a bewildered smile on my face. Days turned to weeks. I went through her possessions, scavenging for any shred of evidence of our life together, but her clothes, her books, her shoes, they seemed aged with dust, artifacts belonging to someone who had long faded from this world. I considered seeing a doctor, fearing I might be slipping into madness, but paranoia whispered that I couldn't trust anyone with this truth. Each night, she slept next to me, her presence both comfort and curse, my mind rebelling against the notion that she might be a figment, a ghost woven from my guilt and longing. Who was this woman sharing my bed? Was she flesh and blood, or a specter masquerading in skin? Investigating further, I discovered something buried, an old journal scribed in my hand, detailing a life with Mary, dates and events meticulously recorded that ended abruptly with a scrawled note: "She comes from a place where reality's veil thins. She was never meant to be here." I trembled as the rest of the page was blurred like it had been swallowed by a memory unstuck from time. Struggling to understand, I decided to confront this imposter directly. "What happened that night?" I demanded, voice cracking like old paint. Her eyes flickered again, momentarily revealing something ancient and inscrutable. "I was never meant to stay," she whispered, her voice a melody of emotion intertwined with remorse. In that moment, reality fractured, and I glimpsed another world, a vast expanse of shadows twisted between glimpses of strange landscapes where the rules of physics dissolved. Suddenly, Mary, if that was her name, reached out, lightly traced her fingers across my cheek, a touch both familiar yet alien. Her skin felt cold, not the kind from winter's chill, but from deep space, endlessly vast and devoid of life. "You have to let me go," she murmured, a single tear trailing a luminous path down her cheek before her form flickered like a fading signal from a lonely star. Just as quickly, reality slammed back into place, yet the emptiness in my home, in my heart, remained. The police came the following morning with questions about Mary's disappearance, a victim of my anguished call made in the throes of my spiraling reality. The world holds strange truths, truths that sometimes slip between worlds. To friends and neighbors, there was no Mary, no wife ever existed in this world. Yet I know different. In deep silence, a framed photograph on my mantel shows us together, and in my heart, the shadow of a shared laugh lingers, fragmented but unyielding. People say when you lose someone, a piece of them stays in your world, alive in memory, haunting in reality, but what if they were never supposed to exist at all? The night air clung to every surface like cold, clammy fingers, an oppressive presence that had become all too familiar in our quiet suburb. My husband and I had moved into this idyllic neighborhood a few years back, hoping to find some tranquility after the chaos that had characterized much of our lives up to that point. Little did we know, tranquility was a fleeting fantasy. It all started when my mother-in-law, Patricia, and my brother-in-law, Jake, showed up on our doorstep late one October evening, a pale and weary desperation etched across their faces. Their story was one of hardship, a series of unfortunate events that left them homeless, living out of their beaten-up station wagon. Soft-hearted as my husband is, he immediately invited them to stay, albeit in the car, assuring them they could use our bathroom and kitchen as needed. I hesitated but eventually agreed, reasoning with myself that family was family. At first, things seemed manageable. They were quiet, unobtrusive, sticking mostly to their vehicle. Occasionally, they'd shuffle inside, eyes downcast, hoping to avoid confrontation, or perhaps avoid raising my suspicions. But inevitably, the peace shattered like splintering glass. As days turned into weeks, strange occurrences began to bleed into our daily life. We'd wake up to fingernail marks scratched into the hood of our cars, Patricia babbling incoherently about protecting the family. Inside the house, I began to notice things out of place, drawers slightly ajar, a whiff of Jake's cologne where I hadn't seen him. The final straw landed with a heavy thud when I woke up one morning to find symbols, bizarre and intricate, etched beneath our windowsills and what looked and smelt like old blood. My husband brushed it off as some kind of prank, but I knew better. Over dinner, I confronted them, asking about the symbols, the disturbances, the eerie sounds echoing late at night. Jake only muttered something about keeping the spirits at bay while Patricia whispered apologies amidst fragmented tales of nightmares chasing them since they left their last home. It was past sundown after I delivered the ultimatum: they needed to leave. A primal fear clawed at me, an instinct that warned of encroaching danger. As they packed their few belongings, the air seemed to buzz, like static before a storm. My husband, torn between empathy and unease, tried to reason with me, but standing firm, I watched them depart, their car swallowed by the shadows that seemed unnaturally eager to embrace them. Sleep eluded me that night, haunted by unsettling dreams of eyes watching from dark corners, whispers creating melodies of madness. A thumping sound woke me, rhythmic and unyielding, coming from the driveway. Peering through the curtains, the sight made my blood congeal. The car was back, rocking aggressively, windows fogged, interior lights flickering on and off like a strobe nightmare. I shook my husband awake, pulling him to the window. As his eyes widened in disbelief, Jake's face appeared, pressed against the glass with a frantic yet vacant look, mouthing words that didn't align with the movement of his lips. I barely registered my husband's steps retreating behind me when the car door swung open, Patricia fighting against something unseen, her cries merging with the snarls of Jake as he lunged forward, only to be yanked back by invisible bindings. The driveway seemed to devour all sound save their tortured wails. I remember dashing outside in a haze, maybe hoping to help, maybe hoping to understand, but all thoughts fell away as I reached out to open the door. The metal scorched my hand like an iron brand. I stumbled back, the temperature around us plummeting as frost crept over the asphalt. Patricia screamed, a sound accompanied by the sickly sweet scent of something burning. Panicked, I pulled my husband back indoors, slamming the door behind us. He was already on the phone, muttering incoherently to emergency services. By the time they arrived, there was nothing but silence, echoes of torment hanging in the air. The car stood emptied, untouched since that frozen encounter, and within it, not a trace of Patricia or Jake. They vanished as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only those ominous symbols I'd seen once under our windows, now carved into the wood of our own front door. We moved away soon after, the neighborhood casting us suspicious glances, some thought us cold-hearted, others mad, but I knew differently. We had survived whatever malignancy had rooted itself in that car, and at night I still hear Patricia's fragmented warnings in the whispers of the wind, pleading for us to remember that some spirits do indeed board vehicles and that the road less traveled often leads to nightmares walking in daylight shadows. It all started with my niece Bella, a bright and imaginative 5-year-old who had an uncanny knack for envisioning things that often sent chills down my spine. I remember it clearly, the night Bella sat cross-legged on the living room floor as we embarked on a quiet evening of board games. Her parents, my sister and brother-in-law, were enjoying a rare night out, blissfully unaware of the eerie events that were about to unfold in their absence. As we pretended to race our pawns to the finish line, Bella paused, her eyes transfixed on something just beyond where I sat, her face pale against the dim glow of the lamp. "Auntie, they're watching us," she whispered, barely audible, her voice quivering with an unsettling certainty. I followed her gaze to the darkened corner of the room, expecting to see reflections or shadows cast as tricks of my imagination, but there was nothing, or perhaps something that only Bella could perceive. I laughed it off, attributing her comment to the vivid imaginings of a child, but an inward shiver made my skin prickle. As the clock ticked past 10, Bella grew increasingly restless, insisting that we close the curtains and turn off all the lights. "They don't like the lights," she explained with an unnerving clarity, as if this were a universal truth everyone should accept. Reluctantly, I complied, more to ease her worries than due to a belief in her unseen observers. However, the encroaching darkness only heightened my unease. With the room now engulfed in shadows, Bella sat silently, eyes wide, as if listening to a conversation from elsewhere, a place only she could reach. "They say it's almost time," she murmured finally, her words hanging thick in the air. A chill rolled down my spine as our seemingly empty home creaked inside, settling in a manner that felt almost sentient, a subtle protest to the unfamiliar presence Bella seemed so attuned to. Was it the house groaning under the weight of my growing fear, or was Bella's awareness of the they in the darkness squeezing a response from its very foundations? Now fully on edge, and unable to shake the sensation of being watched, I proposed that we read a bedtime story, hoping that the comforting act would lull Bella, and me, into abandoning these unsettling thoughts. As I flipped through the pages of her favorite fairy tale, Bella interrupted, her small hand slapping against the illustrations with surprising force. "Not this story," she exclaimed, her eyes filled with an intensity that made me reconsider my dismissal of her earlier claims. "They don't like this one. It makes them angry." The statement slammed into my chest like a punch, knocking the air from my lungs. An inexplicable static seemed to charge the room, buzzing and vibrating just beneath the surface of reality, a tremor only Bella and I could feel. I couldn't shake the building pressure of the silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Desperation clawed at me to reinstate some semblance of normality, yet my words faltered. "Who are they, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to sound calm, yearning for some logical explanation. Bella looked at me then, her eyes now reflective pools, far too ancient for her young face. "They are the ones who know," she whispered, and it was as if the air itself was holding its breath. With no further ceremony, she climbed off the couch, padding softly to the window where the curtains hung like sentries guarding a world just beyond, one that was foreign to me but familiar to her. Peeking through a tiny gap in the fabric, she smiled, a singular glimmer of mischief and conspiracy. "They're here," she announced, beckoning me to witness what she saw. I hesitated, the weight of Bella's statement pressing down on me, pushing the boundaries of reality as I knew it. My mind screamed to retreat, to protect us both, but something intangible, call it curiosity or folly, made me follow. Together we peered through the crack, and the world outside seemed unchanged, peacefully normal, unchanged night. Yet Bella's fingers tapped against the glass in a savant's Morse code, as if she were communicating in a language unspoken and unknown to me. I wanted reassurance, some definitive proof that all was well, but a voice, softer than a whisper yet louder than my thoughts, murmured warnings of ancient truths and veiled eyes hidden by shadows. The street remained ominously still, absent of activity save for the occasional flicker of a passing car's headlights. It wasn't until then that I realized what had been bothering me all night. The neighborhood was silent, utterly devoid of the typical cricket songs or distant hum of late-night televisions. Instead, it was as though the world itself was listening, awaiting whatever revelation Bella was prepared to unveil. I didn't have to wait long. Bella turned to me, eyes wide with a combination of innocence and wisdom that I could never fathom. "There's something beyond the here and now, a place and a knowing that only I can see," she said, each word a dagger that flayed the skepticism from my convictions. "When they come, it changes everything. They reveal the truths you've forgotten, the stories lost to time." Her words lingered in the air, a foreshadowing more tangible than the darkness surrounding us. It was at that moment I understood. Bella perceived the world through lenses I couldn't begin to comprehend, lenses that allowed her to connect unseen dots and resurrect stories buried deep within the echo of our existence. My phone buzzed suddenly, the jarring interruption a lifeline that pulled me back from whatever abyss Bella's words had opened beneath my feet. It was a message from my sister, confirming their imminent return. But as Bella's enigmatic smile broadened, I knew our lives were now woven with the eternal and the unknowable, a fabric threaded by whispers and shadows. Bella had shown me the edge of a vastness I couldn't retreat from, her simple acknowledgement of the mysteries cloaked in the mundane forever altering my perception. As her parents' car pulled into the driveway, casting elongated shadows across the lawn, Bella's fingers intertwined with mine, a silent promise of shared secrets as we watched the delicate dance of light and dark play out beyond the sanctuary of our small, understanding worlds. The night expanded around us, thick with unsolved enigmas, and I knew, deep in my bones, that Bella had indeed shared something known only to the watchers beyond the veil, a hidden knowledge that would haunt and captivate me forever. I first stumbled upon the mystery of OnlyFans in the most unexpected way, through the whispered conversation of two patrons at the shabby bar where I worked late nights. They spoke in hushed tones about a friend, a girl who used to make content on the platform, but had vanished mysteriously, leaving no trace of her presence. The story piqued my curiosity, a familiar sinking feeling I had whenever I was on the verge of uncovering something sinister. After my shift, I began poring through information, scavenging through internet forums and dodgy message boards until I found her, Elena Rain, the handle of the girl in question. Her profile was still active, full of sultry pictures and teasing captions, but something was off. Comments beneath each post were unusually candid, more than just the typical adoration or crass remarks. They pleaded, "We miss you, come back," and ominously warned new viewers to turn back while you can. The backdrop of each photo was eerily identical, despite claiming to be in different locations. A gaudy wallpaper texture that gradually morphed into something resembling faces when you looked too long. The truth clawed at the recesses of my mind, urging me to delve deeper. I subscribed, longing for a clue to her whereabouts, only to find that the messaging feature held the secret. A chat window automatically popped up every time someone new subscribed, featuring Elena with an automated greeting and an open invitation to chat directly. It was a sophisticated AI, crafted to mimic her speech patterns and quirks, enough so that it could fool even the most devoted fans. The system was set to generate personalized videos based on keywords extracted from the ongoing conversation, an AI far ahead of anything I'd ever seen or heard of. I began to test the boundaries, asking questions increasingly unrelated to her supposed persona, trying to break the facade. One evening, my provocative queries must have triggered something because I received an unrequested video link. The thumbnail was wrong, abandoning the glossy allure of typical OnlyFans content, It depicted a pixelated still from a live feed, dimly lit and draped in shadows. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it, terrified excitement coursing through my veins. What I saw was both mundane and terrifying: an empty room, the wallpaper unmistakably the same pattern I'd seen in Elena's photos. But there was more: the subtle sound of breathing behind the camera, labored and frantic, and the faint shadow of a figure lurking just out of sight. The video abruptly ended without any further reveals, leaving me in a state of paranoia and dread. Was this her prison, or the setting of her true fate? I went to the police, and they dismissed my accounts as the ramblings of another internet conspiracy theorist. Desperate, I joined underground networks, connecting with others haunted by the same cryptic encounter. They shared stories of creators who'd gone silent, their absence haunting them. Searches of devoted followers with each dead link clicked, only to be replaced effortlessly by AI. The theory began to solidify like a grim fog, an operation wherein real creators were culled, their lives siphoned away as their digital ghosts were harnessed to perpetuate endless, exotic content that never tired. My research took me to an old industrial district, a place my intuition suggested could hold answers. There I encountered the building from the video, a derelict structure with boarded windows and the same haunting wallpaper, that fabric of discomfort I could now recognize in my sleep. I found a way inside on a rainy night, hollow footsteps echoing against the cold concrete. The place was desolate, yet strangely pristine. Old cameras lined the walls alongside withered flowers and melted candles, as if in dark tribute to the souls captured here. I found a room dedicated to servers, processing units humming rhythmically, their activity seemingly endless, cycling the phantoms of ones who'd vanished. Stacks of dusty tapes and digital drives littered the shelves, the essence of Elena and others reduced to cold data, exploited by anonymous puppeteers I dared not imagine. In that moment, I felt the crushing weight of hundreds, maybe thousands, who had vanished and yet whose digital shadows endured. It was as though I stood upon the spine of an aberrant, subterranean creature, part of a menacing network stretching far beyond what I discovered. I left with evidence, but only whispered parts of the truth to others, too fearful of the power behind the curtains of this grand illusion. Since then, I've remained vigilant, never resubscribing to any service without scrutinizing every detail. But now, every time I see a new OnlyFans post, the tagline of a flashy newcomer with eager eyes, hell-bent on alluring an unforgiving algorithm, I wonder, whose ghost am I really subscribing to?